everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track's first book club patron exclusive podcast, the patron exclusive ABA podcast, where we talk about a book related to behavior analysis. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
Which as I say my introduction, I'm like, you know what? Who would have stumbled upon this episode from our Patreon page to this? They probably knew what they were getting into to listen.
Oh my goodness, I've paid money for this and now I'm going to listen to it? Oh my heavens.
I'm just throwing my money away. Some sort of crazy billionaire who's just paying for whatever Patreon strikes their fancy. We are here online. We are going to be doing our patented book club. It's not patented, I suppose. We're going to be talking all about the book Meaningful Differences by Hart and Risley. And it's not just the three of us. We're actually joined by one of our Inside Tracker patrons. We're joined by Alan, who is one of our Inside Tracker patrons and was able to make some time to chat with us about Meaningful Differences. Alan, say hello to everybody out there.
Let's see. My name is Alan Haberman. I have my master's in education in applied behavior analysis from Arizona State University. I've been a special educator for the last 3 years, but now I'm working as a behavior technician, trying to complete my fieldwork to become a BCBA.
Awesome. And we are so glad that you are trying to make reading a book that you're not being forced to read in school a part of it and then joining us for the conversation. So we're very, very happy to have you here, Alan. And thank you so much for being a patron. We started that not knowing what that was going to be. And just the fact that we've had our first get together and we have an awesome fellow like you joining us today is a real treat. Otherwise, it's just us talking, which we do that anyway. So it's good to have a guest joining us. So why don't we get started by talking about meaningful differences? So I'll do a little introduction, and then sort of like if you've listened to any of our other book club episodes, we're going to talk through a pretty good summary of the book. It's not the audio version, certainly. So you won't learn everything there is to know about meaningful differences, but we're going to hit the big highs, the highlights, the lowlights, perhaps, and then talk a little bit about the context behind the book and then that followed the book. So, meaningful differences. So, I guess let's start just really quickly by going around and saying, what did we heard about this book before it was voted on to be the first of our patron book clubs? Alan, why don't you start it? Is this a book that you were familiar with before offering to give us your time to chat about it with us?
Yeah, well, I had heard about it. Again, just having in the last year or so finished up graduate school, this had come across my radar. But again, having worked for 3 of the last 4 years as a special educator, a lot of the research behind the book is especially well known in public schools. But it's sort of become so out there and so much of a soundbite that it's sort of been disconnected and disembodied from the monograph and the work that Hart and Risley had done. So,
Jackie, how about you? What was your history with this book beforehand?
I heard about this book when I was in my PhD program and I was required to read it as part of my PhD program for, I can't remember what class, I think EIBI potentially.
We took a child development class and we took an EIBI class, and the materials for those two kind of are mixed together in my mind.
I don't think it was EIBI then. I think it was a child development class. It was child development was taught by Dr. Rachel Thompson, and she's the one that all of my notes are from. Because it says Rachel said.
So we won't be hearing any of your original thoughts on Hart and Risley tonight.
And so I had read this book, and I read this book for class, but I was really glad that I read it again, and especially reading it again now in the current climate.
Because it's cold outside now. Just kidding.
What? Yeah.
It's cold outside now.
It's cold outside now. Last time I read it was springtime. For realsies, it was springtime. But I think, how they talk about the research and what they found, and how today we're talking about, not the war on poverty, right, but social injustice and looking to promote, equality for all and make sure that, things are equitable across school systems. It was eye-opening to read right now as I'm looking at things in a different lens, as I'm learning more about my own biases and what I need to do to be a better supporter of everyone. And rereading this book, I had that different lens. And so I have some differing thoughts about the book.
You got some hot takes?
Yeah. then I did the first time I read it. The first time I read it, I like see on my notes, I'm like, whoa, can't believe it. Literally wrote that in the book. I'm like, can't believe that! Exclamation point, exclamation point. So fascinating. Like, I was like, is someone looking at my book to like test me if I've read it?
Those people who write a journal because they hope someone finds it. Dear diary, here's what it's like, I hope someone finds my journal. Like, hot takes.
I hope somebody finds my meaningful differences side comments, because they literally are all that. And I'm like, I wonder what I was thinking. But
okay.
That's me.
That's you. Diana, how about you?
Yeah, so I encountered the book at the same time as Jackie. Were we in class together?
No. You were.
Cool story, guys. Cool story.
Oh, no, we were. No, we
I don't remember because I like jumped tracks at some point.
We're inside track, not
right. No, at this
tracks.
point I was not inside the track. I just jumped tracks because I was on maternity leave. So then I like looped back in with like the next cohort for part of the classes. So I don't remember now, Jackie, if we did this one together
to be
or
fair,
not.
I don't either.
You know, and sadly, I don't think exactly when you took that class is that important for the big discussion.
How do you know?
Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay, apologies.
We don't know, what part of the language that we were hearing is the important part. It's just we want to know if we heard the same language or not. Okay. And I do think that I am looking at it now through a different lens than I probably did at the time. And I am pretty sure it was child development that we were learning about the book in the context of. I wrote a lot of stars. I just starred things. I didn't really write a lot of comments.
I know, because when I took notes for this book, I noticed I was just copying the things you'd underlined and then realized that was a crappy way to take notes. So I had to go back and reread huge swaths of it.
But I will say, and I hope this is okay to say, that I had the paper stuffed inside my book that was our assignment for this book.
Oh, yes.
And I printed it out and it just says, oh yeah, it is child development. It says it on the top. And it's like 2-sentence instructions. It's just like, write a summary of this book. Have it be 3 to 5 pages long.
Oh man, we could have just read your summary online.
That was like my final for like the whole class, I think. It was just like, yeah, just write a 3 to 5 page. And like, that's all we had to go on, which I kind of love.
Wow. Apparently.
Welcome to your doctoral program. That's all they give you to go on.
Wow. So Alan, by listening to this, you and I sound like we're going to get some PhD course credit. All right. Sounds good.
Right. Sounds wonderful.
Yep. 2 whole hours worth.
Yeah. Well, if it's a 3 to 5 pages. That's.
I don't have the paper, just to be clear.
I was
only the instructions. I don't remember what I wrote.
I could write 5 pages after reading it.
You can write 5 pages on anything.
That's my talent.
Yeah.
I'll transcribe the whole podcast and put that in the appendix toward my total page count.
There you go. That's it, Alan. We got to think. Work smarter, not harder, as I always say. Phrase I coined there. Yeah. So my first reading of this book was to prepare for this show because I'd never read this book. I think, Diana, you had told me about it. And I, for some reason, just decided that to conflate the idea that Hart and Risley were behind incidental teaching and then the meaningful differences, 30 million word gap. I just thought they went together. So I just assumed that all of their research was summed up in this one book. So I've just kind of erroneously thought that forever now. Well, not forever, but until I was preparing for this. So this is just where all the incidental teaching came from, as opposed to incidental teaching came before this book. And then they were building on the work that they'd done when Hart and Risley had developed incidental teaching as a technique. So I was all sorts of confused. So I feel like I've straightened it out a little bit more, but I never read this book. I'm sad to say that I was in education. I'm still in education too. I feel like I never hear anyone talk about the 30 million word gap. I sort of forgot that was a thing until I was, looking at sort of the fallout and then the sort of subsequent years of research after this book. So I completely forgot that was a thing because I don't remember it in the book that they specifically talk about there's a 30 million word gap. I mean, there's a lot of numbers in this book. And they do sort of extrapolate things like how many more millions of words would someone from, the higher SES, the higher socioeconomic class might have learned or be speaking by the time they reach age 6 versus someone from a lower socioeconomic class. But I don't even know if that was part of the sound bites or if someone just, some headline was written with 30 million word gap and that's where we got that. But again, I saw a lot of numbers and I did not see that one specific one written actually in this book. Spoilers.
I never found the 30 million in the book.
Okay.
I didn't either.
Alan, did you see it? You found some other research before we started recording that we probably should have had.
I think it's in one of the articles that is sort of closely tied up with this. But you're right, because all throughout the end notes and everything, they're like, the children said about 20,000 words in one day and blah, blah. Yeah, they do a lot of that. So I didn't see that one specifically, but I knew it was related to this book.
Just in sort of hearing your summaries, it sounds like everyone here has some interesting thoughts and some hot takes that they're going to be sharing throughout the discussion. And then sort of when we talk about what happened after meaningful differences, whereas as someone who just read this for the first time, I found it a delightful read and will probably be the Hart and Risley cheerleader on the show. So, hey, everybody, I'll be the Hart and Risley apologist and I'll defend them to my dying breath because I have very little experience with this material. Oh, well, someone's got to toot that job, right? You guys can be all angry and,
I'm not angry.
No, I know. I don't mean angry. I couldn't think of a better adjective. My richness of my sentences are no good. I don't have enough adjectives or past tense verbs.
Give me some more quality, Rob. I need more quality.
Well, much like spoiler alert, who I found, it's more about how much you talk to some extent.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It all works out in the wash.
OMG. Just to build on that, I don't want to discount the work that Hart and Risley have done here, and they really are pioneers in our field. And particularly, I want to give a shout out to Betty Hart, who is one of the only women behavior analysts working, not the only one, but one of the only women working in the field back in the 70s. And I like her work, so I don't want to discount it entirely, right? It's just the times have changed, and I think that looking back now, there's some like squidgy parts here where we might talk about things differently or pull some different conclusions from it, which is what we're going to do.
Sounds good.
But, you're not a science unless you progress.
Well, I was just saying, in being pioneers, like this longitudinal study that they've done, even the critics acknowledge that that's really set a really high bar that's very hard to meet. Thousands of hours of video to sort of code and transcribe and everything. So, you're totally right that they deserve a lot of credit, especially Hart. And for that reason, I think we've come a long way in education and behavior analysis. So we can learn from the mistakes that we see or the gaps.
I think gaps is probably the term, because so much of, I think, the criticism that's come after this book has really been couched in, we've learned so much since then. It just wasn't going to be taken into account by a researcher back then. And so much they had to deal with to put this research together that some of those extra thoughts are ones like, well, those weren't going to come into play right then and there. Like they might not come into play as effectively right now in research, given just sort of the difficulty of doing the study. So yes, I think we'll think about it like gaps. So it's not all going to be sunshine and roses with meaningful differences. But again, so much going on in this book. So let's...
Sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows everywhere.
We've kind of gotten into some of the content. We'll get more into the content. But why don't we do what I think is always fun to do? Because no matter what you are writing, whether you are writing a research paper, whether you are writing a research book, I do think there's something to be said for, was this book fun to read at all? Because there are so many research books that I'm sure say many important things. They're written so poorly, or they are just so turgid. No one's going to
love that word.
No one's going to know what you're writing about. I would like to say that as a book, meaningful differences, they're not trying to write to an audience that's not interested in reading a research-based science book. There are a lot of graphs. They're not dumbing down their language, though some of their language is not exactly what we would consider, I think, behavior analytic in terms of not quite the precision. But there are some talks of, things like schemas comes up a lot, or symbolic language, terms that some folks use, but maybe we don't use quite as much when talking about language.
I mean, this is appealing to a broader audience than solely behavior analysts as well, right?
Yeah.
So this should be pulling in educators, developmental psychologists, et cetera. So there's plenty of room to use that type of language.
I overall found the book very readable. I thought it read very much like a research mystery. Like you start with your introduction and it's like, what's going on with the children's language? Why isn't everyone learning to speak better? Why is there this gap between people from low and high socioeconomic classes? So we need to get into this. And then they sort of are like, first, we're going to get the crew together. We're going to get together all the terms we're going to be using. Like we're going to talk about how many nouns and verbs, or how are we defining the quality or the richness of language? Okay, we got the crew together. Now we're going to describe the study, and here are the steps we did. Then they go into the research. And so the last couple chapters in that regard, because I was reading it like, ooh, what's going to happen next? So the last couple chapters were kind of a letdown because they're like, here are some facts and graphs to discuss, which was not the book I thought I was reading for the first 6 chapters.
Where's
and then
the
chapter 7,
scene?
it hit me like a ton of bricks. Like, wait a minute, this is a learning book. No, thank you. But I read it again, before this episode, because knowing that was the one I had like the least amount of, the least that I just sort of read and like took it. Like, I get it right away. But going back and reading it, it was very interesting. And then I thought their conclusions were very strong and powerful, especially given the time frame, sort of the 90s, sort of how we thought about poverty back then. I think the message that they had was great. Their final conclusions, I thought were terrible and were not very actionable in a lot of ways, in that they sort of were like, here's what has to be done. Who'll do it? Shrug. I don't know. Maybe you, the reader at home. And then that's the end of the end question mark was kind of. So I sort of felt a little let down by the ending, and I could sort of see why there were so many people who really just grabbed onto the message here and why it's become so much a part of a lot of early intervention programming through the years, but also why there are a lot of people who would say, wait a minute, slow your roll. We got to go back to look at some of this research and talk about some of the limitations. So again, my general thoughts on the book. How about the rest of you? What were your kind of just general thoughts?
Full disclosure, when I read the book and they're talking about the research that they're doing, and then they told the readers their research question, literally felt nauseous, because that is such a huge question, right? And they're like, we're just going to ask this like incredibly large question, and then we're going to take data for 6 years, and we're going to take data on everything at all times. And I'm like, while I'm reading this, thinking about me doing that research, started sweating a little bit. Like, and my husband came in the room and he's like, are you hot? And I'm like, no, I'm anxious for these researchers right now because it seems impossible what they want to do. And they're like, it'll be fine. We got this. And then I love when like, they're like, we thought we were going to have 150 families. And then when we only got 45, we're like, wow.
Thank God.
Too many already.
Yeah, there was some real cliffhangers there, Jack. It's like, how are we going to get out of this one?
Yeah, right? And so I love that. And I also love, like, you could feel the annoyance of them. They're like, and then we had to code all of this data. That transcription for 1 minute, for 1 hour took 17 days. Not really, right? But it took like
8 hours.
It was 8 hours.
And then they're like, and then people would leave. And then we had to have someone else come in. You could feel, I felt when I was reading, I could feel their exasperation at trying to answer the question.
There's definitely a passage in there. Yeah, the kind of, I'm going to throw up. This is terrifying, the idea of it, where they, between them and their observers, 6 observers total, I think, they're like, we didn't take a vacation or take a day off for 2.5 years while they're doing these, like, I was like, oh my God, like, oh. God, I'm like, if I went back in time, I'm like, sorry, Betty, Todd, I'm out. I don't want to be part of your study anymore. Good luck with that.
Well, like they had that one family that lost 2 observers.
Because they were like me and they're like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah. And then they're like, well, now, like, then they only put that family with like their top observer from then on. They're like, you can't quit on them.
Got to surrender to the war on poverty. We can't win. Sorry.
Another thing I was thinking is I really loved how they led us into how they collected the data, their process of like, okay, now we have all of this data. What are we going to do with it? And then like what they kept, what they coded. Was it as precise as I would want it to be? No, probably not. But I mean, give them credit for having all the data, right?
It was so much. It's just so much.
Yeah, so I don't envy the recorders of that at all. And I'm also a little bit sad we don't know who they are. Can you imagine spending every single day recording data for 2 years and not even getting a shout out?
It must be somewhere in there. I read the acknowledgments and I don't remember seeing it. Might have been one of the endnotes pages or
not people's names. Nope.
Maybe they got some grad credit. Yeah.
That's the worst grad credit ever for 2.5 years. That is something I like what struck a chord with me. I was like, oh, just give me your name. Like, who knows? Tasha. Thanks, Tasha. But I loved how, they walked us through how they took data, when they stumbled upon problems, then what they did next, and then how I liked the progression because it made me feel a little bit better as a researcher. How if, Betty Hart and Todd Risley don't get it all right the first time, that it might be okay that I don't too. But yeah, I like how they just like didn't have graphs until the end. They're like pepper in the book, and then they're like graph. Like the last like couple chapters is like, hey, every page is a graph.
That. It was a lot of graphs, and then a lot of tables. They had a lot of the data at the end too. Alan and Diana, what were kind of your just general thoughts about it as a work of research-based nonfiction?
Having only read it in sections or sort of a page copied as part of like my teacher training, I sat down and was like, Risley and Hart, Wolf, those names sound really familiar. Oh my goodness, this is like a really big seminal work. And then like Bloom, so I sort of realized like, this is a much different book than I was expecting just by the title. Because the title, I think, just sort of makes it sound a little more dated than I was expecting. But yeah, no, like it was we're going to open up by talking about the war on poverty and how it was a failure. Okay, well, that certainly sets the tone of like the book and what we're going to be talking about. And is there any optimism? Maybe, maybe not. But then, and also just thinking about when it was published, this is around the time of the bell curve being published, and it's, sort of horrendous, notoriousness. And I think coming from ABA and having worked in special education, especially with working with people with autism, I kept forgetting that we're talking about just sort of typically developing children as we were reading it. And so I was sometimes sort of jarred back into, we're talking about sort of the typical developmental experience, because that really does change what we're talking about in some of the like methodology and what they're aiming for and what they're looking at. So overall, I mean, it was, I would never say that this book is fun, but it was an enjoyable read and relevant to my interests as an educator. So
you know what? At least it was an enjoyable read, right? And Diana, how about you? Where are you on this book?
Let's see. So I'm with Jackie, and then I really enjoyed the reading about the process of conducting this incredibly huge undertaking that they did. And the way in which it's written is just so enjoyable, because it takes you back to like Skinner's writing and like Mont Wolf, and how they would just go through like a story, right? Like you'd hear the story of the research. And often when you're reading a publication in a journal, there's just no room to get into those types of details. So that's probably why they wanted to write this as a book, because they just had the opportunity to expound upon it and give you, I think, in some ways, necessary details about what their thought process was behind the research. So I really enjoyed it from that perspective. But then I'm also with Alan in that the topic it's like, it just kept unfolding, and you're like, well, but then on the next page, they're going to tell me something that sounds good. It doesn't make me feel like so uncomfortable about what the things are that they're saying, right? And so it's a page turner in that sense, where you're like, it's going to get better. Then we're going to get to some stats that are like, forgiving and revelatory and bolstering. And no, you don't ever really get that part. So it's like a tough read in that sense. And then, I know we'll talk at the end, like what are we supposed to do with this? But there's no sort of finality as far as a way forward from the data that they discovered. So it's a bit of a downer.
I think it's a truism about life and society, in that we are always going to be looking to, I hope we will always be as a society looking to see how can we improve the lives of everyone who is a part of this society. And that's beyond, certainly the scope of like, well, how do people want their lives to be improved? What's a value to different people based on culture, based on their social groups, all that. Beyond that, everyone would love it, I think, if everyone just felt like they were doing better every day. And we'd all love it if we felt like we were a part of that change. But there's a real reality to, well, that level of systemic change is going to be very hard and take sacrifice and work. So there's no way you're going to read a book like this where it starts out describing all the failed war on poverty, which, just listen to that title, The War on Poverty. Like, if we could just shoot poverty enough, it would go away. Like we have to fight it, as opposed to, well, it's what are we trying to do? We're trying to support everybody. It's not a war. Like, a war is sort of a bad idea to take it. There wasn't going to be that moment of like, and then we found the secret. We'd sent the wrong books to the lower socioeconomic class schools. That was all these years, the wrong ones with the wrong letters. And if only we'd sent to the right, but it was always going to be, there's something that is going to be hard to change if, beyond even the question of, is this something that should be changed, or any questions about the research design that sort of have come out in the years since. There was always going to be there's a huge problem. Why do some people seem to have better outcomes than others? And is it something that can even be targeted for change if one were to choose to do so? It was always going to be a big issue. It's one of the reasons that I'm increasingly frustrated with every aspect of my life, in which it's like, let's make a big change. And everyone's like, what if we just did something? What if we did a lecture? What if we did a lecture on cultural competence? What if we did a lecture on helping people with disabilities? Won't that solve it? It's like, well, no, because if that were the case, we would have solved all these problems like 75 years ago when people started doing lectures on whatever given topic it is. Everything requires a lot of work. It is hard and a lot of debate. So, don't read this book thinking that the answer is in the book, because it is not. There are guideposts to sort of some of the areas we might want to be focusing on. But even knowing this information, it's not like, and then after this was published in 1995, have you noticed the socioeconomic gap just getting smaller and smaller over the years? The answer is no, we have not noticed. We have not noticed that. I think the best research I found coming out after this is that people who haven't gone to college do seem to have closed some of the language gap, but possibly all that reflects is people who do have those benefits and went to college are just doing so much better. And then people who were doing worse have either just gotten worse so that they're at the same level as people who had been doing worse, quote unquote worse. I don't want to use a pejorative to describe a group of people in that regard. It's not necessarily that the gap has widened in many ways, and the areas it's closed, it's not necessarily closed in a way that I think, at least people around the time of this research would have said, yes, that's the right direction. So big question. So if you were listening to this and hoping at the end of about the hour, 45-minute mark, we had and the answer is this, that is not going to be the rest of this podcast, but please don't turn it off. We got a lot of fun things to say about this.
But wait, there's more.
So I guess with a little bit of that discussion of what makes a book out of the way, let's get into the book itself. And so we'll sort of do what we often do in our book clubs and kind of hit, not exactly chapter by chapter, but sort of following the flow of the book. What were the big takeaways? What did we learn? What do we think is interesting? What do we think people who are like, I might read this book someday? Well, here's some information that you should totally know. And then read the book as well, because we're not going to say that this is the definitive podcast about meaningful differences. And I mean, it'd be great if it were, but I don't think it's going to be a good podcast about meaningful differences. So let's get into chapter 1, Intergenerational Transmission of Competence. Some of these chapter titles, I tell you, some of them felt very touchy-feely, and some of them were very scientific. I would not have called chapter 1 of my book Intergenerational Transmission of Competence, because also competence does imply people who don't do as well, quote unquote, do as well by some of the metrics we use to sort of rate that are incompetent, which is not the case.
It's not the case. And they said that multiple times within this book.
So why they chose that as chapter 1 title,
I don't know.
It's a little weird.
I mean, I don't want to speak too soon, but I also feel like it's just important to get it out there from the get-go that entirely what we're looking at here is correlational data.
Yes.
Right from the start. And I'm sorry, I'm sure there's later points in which I'm supposed to make my points. So, I mean, when you're doing this level of descriptive analysis, right, the best you can hope for is correlational data. And I understand why they're starting out trying to ask this question. Because they say, we still see these gaps in performance for young kids, right? And we want to try to figure out why. We are very interested in language. So that's the measure that we're going to dive deep in to try to determine, right? And lo and behold, they did find a difference. But that doesn't mean that that's the important difference, right? And they're not ever going to be able to straighten that circle, right? In knowing if that correlation that they discovered is the reason why they see this difference over time. And then the other point I just want to make sure that I'm getting out there at the start of this is they're making comparisons based on a certain end result, right? And it's not just IQ, but IQ is fitted in there as well. And we need to be aware that some of those types of outcome measures that they're looking at are potentially biased towards certain groups of individuals. So it begets their kids are going to do better on a test that's developed by professors, right? I do worry a little bit that by the choice of outcome measures that they're sort of hanging their hat on, that they may have reached a preconceived conclusion about the research, and there may be some other correlational variables that are unaccounted for.
I think what's important that we make sure we do, because I don't want to discount the point that you were making, Diana, because a lot of the research that has come out referring to Hart and Risley's work in the years since really does speak to, part of it is on, were these the best measures? Both in terms of, were these meaningful measures at all? Also in terms of what cultural bias might exist, as well as other, limitations to the research based on sort of, is this research, from psychology, it's not taking into account a lot of the components of good research that all these observations would entail. So it's not like an ethnographic study. And there are ways that you would do an ethnographic study versus a psychological study that wasn't taken into account. I mean, I read it from somewhere and then I put it in my notes. So it's not like I just had this thought while I was reading the book.
I think I just want to get that stuff off my chest now so that everyone's not going into this who's listening thinking that like,
Diana to Hart and Risley, drop dead is what the headlines are going to say.
I'm not doing that either, but I think that it's important if anyone out there is like having these types of concerns that they recognize that we also have those types of concerns. So we're not just like drawing big cartoon hearts all over.
We didn't decide, man, this book written in 1995, there's absolutely nothing that has changed since 1995. Things are exactly the same.
I can't think of a single thing that's changed.
We all agree on what counts as value for everyone in the whole world. Therefore, this is ironclad. No, of course not. But it is a good point to bring up. I think as we go through, I don't want us to not be able to have some of those talks if they come up in conversation. But I do also want to make sure that we go through the book itself as it was published. So as a reader today would sort of get it, So what is the product that they have presented here? And it's a great product in a lot of ways. There are flaws in other ways. Yeah, that is definitely true. And then, we'll talk about a little bit of them through the discussion. But we also, I made sure to save a little section in our timeline of let's talk about what happened after, because I think that's going to be a good place to sort of talk about what came after, both in positives and both in criticisms of the research that are valid, very valid.
Right. And one thing I think they tried to do to level the playing field is they didn't use IQ, right? So they did say in this first chapter, when they're talking about measurement, is IQ was a corollary measure. So that's why they use vocabulary growth, because then it's based on the individual kid and what their current baseline of vocabulary was, and then where they went, at age 2 and above or whatever to age 3. So I do like that they were thoughtful about the measures that they were using. I like that they used vocabulary growth because it seems they're looking at increasing language. That seems like the first place to start, right? Like looking at how much language someone is using. So I do appreciate that they didn't like, okay, we're going to do these battery of tests. They do the battery of tests later, right?
Right.
Do them, but they're not the only measure. So they're not the primary measures of the study saying, oh, look, they had an IQ of 70 in the beginning and now they have an IQ of 80. Yay, you, right? They're looking at increased vocabulary in this naturalistic writing environment. In this first chapter, it really struck me that they make a claim that I don't know that they can, right? But maybe they can, about like by the time a kid is 4, right? Like you can't make up the past. At 4, right? If you don't have it, you'll never have it. And that seems like pretty fatalistic for me. Coming up with a 4-year-old, right? Like my child is going to be 4 like next week. And like, this is it. Hope I did a good job.
They're trying to speak more broadly about sort of the curve you'd expect to see. Again, they did a lot with sort of the language curves, how many words are being added to a child's, individual dictionary, and then later achievement. And sort of that for being kind of the point at which you sort of saw that continued flattening of that curve, at least in the research that they had seen, the research that they were a part of, versus other students who sort of just, you saw that flip side, like it was going up and it just kept on going. And it took a while before it flattened out. And then that's where you get the gap. So my sense was less that they were making it like, nope, 4, we're going to put you in the fail box or the success box. And that idea of that critical period, which you hear that a lot with language. I mean, no one talks about language without talking about a critical period. And there's some truth to the statement in the research in terms of there is probably a period of time in which there are certain developmental milestones. If they are not hit, it's not like growth won't continue, but you will start to see a significant change in the slope of that growth, or a flattening of that growth even. But let's go back. Let's go back to the halcyon days of the 1960s, where everyone was warring on poverty. They weren't warring in Vietnam. They were warring on poverty. For those of you who are not old people who remember the 60s, of which none of us are that old that we remember the 60s either, but we read about it in books, much like some of you might have read about the 80s in books. The big thing was the war on poverty, this idea that if the government throws enough money at research, we're going to come up with the secret sauce to eradicate poverty, and everyone's going to be rich because everyone's going to be better and smarter and have better outcomes, and everyone's going to have an amazing job. This was huge. Alan, I don't know if you've read some in grad school for education, just sort of like all the different programs that were developed in the late 60s to try to remediate education. So this is where a lot of the direct instruction research came from, the Montessori method came from. I have DISTAR in my notes, which I vaguely remember what that is. Were any others that jump out at you, Alan, that you remember from your education days?
Well, so not especially, just because, again, my degree being in ABA, a lot of what we talked about was VB-MAP. So things that were sort of after or developing around this time or much after. Montessori and her research obviously will forever be part of education. I recognize the names of some of these, like Goal and DISTAR, but I can't say that I have any experience with them, just because I think they're probably either we've moved on from them, or they've been embedded into other curricula at this point, and it's sort of been like picked apart and repackaged.
Yeah, that's a good point, Alan. Some of the ones that I know that I've heard more of, they're sort of in the context of, like you said, like that repackaging, or they're called something else nowadays. But in any case, I think we lost the war on poverty. We were losing some wars back then. We lost the war on poverty in a lot of ways, in that there were some kind of promising educational research pieces. There were some promising programs that stemmed from the war on poverty, that I think overall the takeaway was many of the programs that were developed either had no effect whatsoever, had some effect, but because of politics, never were implemented to the scale that they would need to be to actually know if they really were going to work long-term for the majority of America, because it was an American initiative, the war on poverty. And this is sort of where the work of Hart and Risley, I don't want to say began, but this is where Meaningful Differences research began. Because Hart and Risley were working at the Turner House, which was a preschool in Kansas City. And it was working on intervention for language to sort of improve the spontaneous speech of younger impoverished students, or students from sort of low socioeconomic class. I know socioeconomic class is not a term that everyone is either familiar with or likes to hear. They use it all the time in this book, so we will be using it a lot as well. We'll be talking about high socioeconomic class, quote unquote, rich people, medium socioeconomic class, or the working class, which I was a little unclear if they meant like, they're talking about like plumbers or like electricians. They didn't really quite define that, because I know most of the plumbers I know actually make quite a bit of money, because it's a skill nobody knows how to do without specialized training anymore. And then they talked about low socioeconomic class. And then they talked about, welfare recipients, sort of a separate class, so that they were not even considered in the socioeconomic class.
Yeah, it was interesting that they didn't give any money according with that, right? Like, professors actually don't make that much money.
Ooh, sick burn.
Right? So it would be interesting to know, like, how they made that decision.
I think it was more like white collar, blue collar.
Yeah.
The categories don't function really, I think, in the same ways anymore.
No.
That they would have then.
One thing that I thought was interesting or kept in mind was that welfare, even 25 years ago, looks different, because this is in the era of the Reagan and Clinton reforms to welfare that stopped a lot of the direct cash assistance and became more of the temporary assistance or Section 8 housing and things like that. So some of these families and some of this research, like, welfare doesn't even mean the same thing as what we think of it as now, in terms of our policy and the impact of welfare and using welfare on the families we work with.
That's a good point, Alan. And it probably would have looked even different back when Hart and Risley were starting their work back in the 60s too, like just what that program was in the different areas of research. But yeah, in the 80s when they were doing it, does that look like modern welfare? And boy, I'm glad you brought that up because I did not even think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a great book by two Harvard policy people. I can never think of their names, but I think it's $4 a day. And it's just about the changes to welfare in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and sort of its impact today. And it's really interesting because some of these families probably are their demographic information is relevant to sort of what that book is, because the $4 a day book is about how the welfare reforms seem to have benefited white families more than families of color and things like that. And since the sample for the welfare group in this book are primarily, African-American families, there's a lot to be said about what that means and what that looks like. And when we're talking about what their needs are and what has changed in that 25 years.
Well, at least at the time, their original work, their results were, not promising. So certainly this is where I think a lot of the incidental teaching work came from, was their work at the Turner House. And the sense that they were getting was like you said, Jackie, not to categorize kids at 4 as this is what the rest of your life looks like. But what they would find is that they did all this work on improving spontaneous speech and increasing the amount of language that the children in their program were using. And it seemed to be working and everyone was excited. And then the kids would go to school and any benefit or effect sort of just seemed to wash out. They still were showing up to school and they'd be behind children who were from, wealthier families, which again comes to that question. Okay, are the kids who are doing better, they're just doing better because they're rich? Or is there something about those children or their experiences that led to their, seeming ability to be doing better than these other children who came from poorer households? So they kind of continued that line of research. They said, well, there's got to be a reason that this is happening. And why does it seem, and then they looked at sort of some of their colleagues or some of their friends at the University of Kansas, their professor friends who had kids in the daycare. And these kids are just talking all the time. And they noticed pretty quickly, like, these kids just keep talking. And the kids in our Turner House program, they do not talk as much. Like when they talk, they're talking well, they talk nicely. You wouldn't notice anything about it. But then when you compare them, you just see just how much more language is going on. So they said, okay, we've got to increase that language curve, that growth curve of language, which is sort of, this is where I think they started getting that idea of let's look at those language curves. We got to close this gap. We got to shoot poverty so fast, with our research, I guess, because it's a war. What reason could it be? Could it be, number one, that there's a cultural difference in terms of the families of our professor friends' children and the children in this Turner House program? So again, lower socioeconomic or children from families receiving welfare. Is it that they're just more experiences that those professor kids get? Or is it that they're getting more experience and they're mediated by more adult interaction around those experiences? So they put, a little anecdote about the little experiments they set up. So they set up their preschool to try to look like what their homes would look like in the Turner House. So maybe because the kids are in this like weird new environment, they're just not talking as much as they normally would. So they tried to make preschool look more like what they would see in their house. So same materials, same activities. And no, the kids talked, they talked more about what they saw, but it didn't really accelerate anything. So again, the kids could all talk. They just weren't talking as much.
I did love that they were like, and then we found the sofa that most families have. I just like that they were like, what could it be? Is it the sofa? Let's hone in on the sofa.
Pick one variable. You got to test it.
Have you guys seen the picture on social media that's like your grandmother had this sofa and it's like it's got wooden arms and then the back of it is like cream color and it has like a rust colored landscape?
Oh yeah, I had that. I haven't, but I have it.
My aunt had that sofa. Like exactly that sofa. Mm-hmm. Everyone, and maybe it was that sofa.
That was the sofa I had growing up.
So. Yeah. It was ubiquitous.
Well, I did not have that sofa. And that's why I talk more than all of you, I guess. Different experiences.
Oh, God.
Then they decided to look at just kind of experiences. And this I love. This sounded like the most enriched preschool ever. Like they just were like, for weeks and weeks, we are going to go on field trips. We're going to go like everywhere. And I don't think they were like the museum field trips, like the Museum of Modern Art. I think they went to like the bank and the library and the grocery store. They just went to lots of places. And then the kids would just have more to talk about because they're doing all these things. And like, no, not really. It didn't really change what, the kids had fun. Everyone had a good time. but nobody seemed to be talking more, which is what they wanted to see. So they said, okay, here's what we'll do. Not only will go on our trips, but when they come back, we'll have changed the preschool to look like the place we just were. We'll have like the role play center and all these items. So they went to the bank and now we've got checkbooks and, play money. And again, the kids really loved it. This did seem to slightly increase how much vocabulary the kids were using. So it did increase the amount of vocabulary, but it was a very temporary growth. So while those materials were there, the kids talked about the materials. Once the materials were gone, the kids stopped talking about those things.
So yeah, I think it would be awesome if like a year down the road, they're like, man, bank tellers, am I right? Right? Like when do you add in like bank teller into your like everyday language?
It's like a deposit slip, Jackie. You have to sign it using your John Hancock.
Did you get your carbon copy?
So again, they found a lot of interventions that could increase the total size of the children's vocabulary, but it couldn't accelerate the growth with which those children would learn vocabulary once all of that extra teaching was gone. So again, the goal of can we change the sort of the trajectory these kids seem to be on was out of their grasp. So by the end of chapter 1, we've got Hart and Risley. They're doing the Charlie Brown, like they got their head down. They're walking home from Turner House and going, it just feels like everything we're doing has a short shelf life. And by 4, whatever vocabulary growth was there sort of established, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot to do to sort of accelerate anymore. Like that's sort of the trajectory that kid's on. We failed. We've got to go back, much like Doc Brown, they got to go back in time to figure out what is that secret sauce. And it's got to be coming before the children turn 4. So they hopped in their DeLorean, which had not been invented as of the 1960s. They had to wait till the 80s when the research was done.
Well, maybe they'd already been to the 80s. Brought back the DeLorean.
Oh, okay. So that brings us to chapter 2. And this is where the research that they will talk about through the rest of this book really begins. And so this is, I kind of talked about at the beginning, this is like the heist movie. This is sort of where they start talking about getting their team together and what are they going to do as a team. So I thought this was just by far the most interesting chapter in the book because, you probably have Jackie's response of like, who would make this a research project? This is crazy. But they knew what they needed to do. They just weren't quite sure how they would get the information. And as much as you're thinking, and they thought of some really smart way to do it. They were like, no, we're just going to have to find families and watch kids talking with parents and parents talking with kids and record every single interaction so we can figure out which of those seem to matter in this language growth curve. Like where are the kids learning quickly vocabulary or not learning quickly vocabulary? So what are the variables? And again, it wasn't something they knew was going to be simple because they knew from their interactions with children that it's not like, oh, I'm talking to this kid for 5 minutes. This kid's from the welfare group or this kid's a professor's kid. Because in talking with the kids, they all were very pleasant. They had a great time. They all used words. They all talked. It was only when you were sort of comparing how much more talking there was in the professor's preschool did they notice the difference. Otherwise, it was like, oh, the kids are doing great. Like they're all having a great time. They're all nice. We're all having fun. And again, you don't want to wait until they're 4 and say, ooh, sorry, I guess I should have noticed how you weren't learning as much vocabulary as you needed to, kids. Sorry, you're in the fail bin now. No one wants to feel that way. So they got to go back in time and start their longitudinal study, with which I use a lot of swear words to describe in my notes just how horrible the process of putting together a longitudinal study for this amount of families, this amount of data must have been. Basically, it was we're just going to watch. We're going to watch as many families as we can. Jackie already said at the top, they wanted 100. They ended up with 42. And every month, we're going to send an observer into that house and they're going to hang out for an hour. And they're just going to like stare at the child. Not videotape, they audio record.
Yeah. They're like a microphone in their pocket.
Yep. Everything that was said to the child, everything that was said in the environment. They take notes while they're there. They're going to write down all the interactions because it's not enough to just know what was said. You have to know who said it, who was it said to, then you have to code what was said. So they have to take notes there. They have to transcribe all this audio and they have to do it month after month after month after month before they can even
just for 2.5 years
do the data analysis, which required a computer, which I assume was one of those big like house-sized computers because it was the 80s.
Oh, yeah. Maybe
they had an IBM PC.
Right. So 42 families, 1 hour a month. That's 42 hours of videotape a month.
Audio tape,
sorry. And then it would take 8 hours to code that. 8 hours for each hour.
Yeah. On average. Some were worse.
Yeah.
Some were better.
Yeah.
Better in terms of length of time.
So that's like 320 hours a month of work.
So I don't want to spend too much time on all the nitty gritty of this chapter, though I took a lot of notes on it. I loved the process they would, because again, just hearing that, you're thinking, okay, so they just started going into houses and everything. No, before they went into the houses, they started doing videotaped interactions between parents and children to start recording what happened, because they had to define what it was they were looking for. Because can you imagine if you'd spent 2.5 years, 42 hours every month of all these transcriptions, and then you're like, all right, what is it we care about? How do we define these terms? And then you're making it up as you go. God, that's the actual ultimate nightmare of we did all this work. What do we do with it? So they knew what they were looking for the most part, because it's
like when your advisor says, this is great what you've done, but I really want to know now about this other variable that you didn't retake data on. So can you just please go back and retake data on every single session? That is the ultimate nightmare.
Except you might not be able to do that because the time has passed and your transcription is your transcription. So they spent a lot of time just figuring out what are the behaviors that we should be looking at in terms of these types of interactions. Then what is the language that we're looking at? And so, because they had to figure out what might matter, what might not matter. So again, people talking, two adults talking probably doesn't matter, because what matters is someone talking to the child or the child talking to an adult. After they sort of had a sense of what they wanted, they started doing these short observations with all the observers. Sort of like what you think of as IOA in terms of what does it look like to observe someone and take this data? And then they're talking about how they built up their tolerance to do a half-hour observation with 90% agreement. So you're seeing all these people just doing all this, like they're training for the marathon, really, just in terms of what is it we care about? What is it we need to pay attention to? Then they found their friends and they're like, hey, I'm going to come over to your house and practice for my longitudinal study, right? I'm going to see what you do. So, they added some codes, they took away some. So for example, they figured out that we want to take data on proximity to the child. And then they realized that is impossible. They're are we really going to estimate 10 feet away as close or not close to the child? So they got rid of some of the codes. They added some others. So again, if talk's not addressed to a child, we do want to know that, because again, what is the impact of hearing conversations, even if you're not a part of them? So they did all of this. It took over 4 months just to be prepared to do the 2.5-year longitudinal study. Then they had to get participants. And again, their goal was really, and I think this was sort of the part that was the most forward thinking of the research in terms of sort of what we would think about as looking at cultural bias today, and that they didn't want to just look at their friends' kids. They wanted to go across socioeconomic classes. They wanted to have different family sizes. They were thinking about racial backgrounds. And they wanted to make sure they started young, because they didn't know where was that period of time before 4 years old that was most important. And they also wanted to make sure, let's start before the kids are talking, so that we get a sense of what is it like in that household, and the household gets a sense of what it's like to have this person here every single month. So hopefully they'll somewhat habituate to, hey, I'm here for my monthly hour-long observation of all your interactions. And also they tried to look for parents that had working mothers and fathers. They weren't specifically trying to look for intact families, though almost all of the families were intact. I think there were only 8 that were single-family households. And they came together with, they did mention that they had 3 families. They never met the father, which is you were there for 2.5 years and you never met the father. Where was that guy? What was he doing?
You have to remember, Rob, they came at the same time every month. So it could be that they came at the same time when he was at work. It's not like they varied their time and sometimes came on weekends and sometimes came in the evening. They said they tried to make the schedule as consistent as possible, which could be a limitation of the study, right?
Yeah. Well, they allowed the families to choose that hour. I still think just statistically, if I showed up to someone's house every day, monthly, same day, I would eventually see most of what your house has to offer just by just by chance, right?
I worked with many families where I never met the dad.
No, I guess that's true. But were you there for 2.5 years?
Sometimes.
The same time. Okay. So maybe that's just me. So they looked for families. They had 13 families that they were considered upper socioeconomic, 10 middle, 13 lower socioeconomic class, and then 6 that they were categorized as welfare families. They did have an African-American family in each category, though again, the numbers were not, I can't say, I don't think that they were necessarily representative of sort of the overall percentage of African-Americans sort of in the United States population at the time. So we had, 1 in the upper socioeconomic class, 3 in the middle, 7 in the lower. And then all 6 of the welfare families were African-American families, which again, I think is going to come into some of the discussion we have of where was there some cultural bias in this study potentially? That would be a source, a likely source of that. So there were a total of 17 African-American families. There were 23 girls that they looked at of the 42 families. They had 11 of the families. The child they were observing was a firstborn, 18 was a secondborn, and 13 were the third or later born child. So those are their families. They were paid $5 for every observation. And the observers, they started up against a wall. So they were trying to be as far away from, I think, the family's goings on as possible. They were only looking at the child unless the parents spoke to them. So they really were trying to be, like hide at first and just like not pretend to not be there. They weren't interacting with the child. They weren't playing with the child. They were just sort of there to watch.
That would be like the hardest part.
Oh yeah, not playing with these little kids and you're watching them grow up. Oh yeah. They also would only follow the child if the child left, if the parent gave permission. And I'll be honest, after 2.5 years of having to transcribe, I'd probably be so excited if the child left the room and it's like, whoo, that's 10 minutes. I now don't have to transcribe what went on because I couldn't see. And they allowed the families to choose the time. So a lot of the families, they said, chose times where it was easier for them to complete tasks around the house. So they'd, give the child something to do and then they'd, go do the dishes or cook. And then they'd come check in on the child every now and again. They had the same observers, like you said, Diana. Occasionally, they had a few families that agreed to do these reliability checks. So you get 4 observers in your house at the same time, which again, just shows such a level of researching fortitude to just continue with these procedures for 2.5 years. It's crazy.
Yeah. But also the magnanimity of the families that allowed these observers to come into their home for 2.5 years and were willing to let them come anytime. And they were like, they always worked out a time with us when we could come. And then like you're saying, sometimes you'd have more than one observer there. And that's a really big deal that they allowed this to happen.
Yeah, and Hart and Risley are very thankful to their families.
I was going to say, I think that in this chapter, they do try very hard to talk about the respect, but we ended up feeling, above all, a profound pride in American families and the promise of their future. Like the children all learned to be good, contributing members of the family. They really were trying to heap the praise and show respect to these families for all of their time, especially since they talk about the last 6 months, it's taking just ridiculously long amounts of time to do this work because the children have also richer vocabularies compared to when they started. So I did notice just that tone is very positive in this chapter.
Mm-hmm. So they do all this work. They've got 1,318 transcripts when it's all done, which is pretty much over 1,000 hours of observation done. And they started to do the work of using a computer. I kind of wish they described what their computer was doing because it just felt like a magic computer. What do they just putting the printouts of these transcripts in the computer? And it's like, I gotcha. I know what you're looking for. Because they had to code all these interactions. So they were looking at how many nouns were spoken, verbs were spoken, modifiers, functors, which is not a term I knew I had heard before, but refers to pronouns, prepositions, demonstratives, and articles. Got to know how many A's and does were spoken. No, I mean, maybe it's a language term. I don't know.
It's not a pretty word.
No, I didn't like it. Every time they'd say it, I'd be like, what are they talking about here? Did something bad happen? What happened here? They coded proper nouns as their own code because those are often very specific to the family. They coded words that they weren't interested in. So they didn't care as much about swear words or animal sounds, private words. So words that a family made up to sort of describe. So they weren't looking at those. Again, might that have been valuable information?
Family uses so many made up words.
I mean, most of the words we use are Simpsons references. So, that would limit our vocabulary growth, I think. Then they also looked at things like, how long were the utterances? Were they sentences, phrases? How many clauses were there? Was it a statement? Was it a question? Was it a demand? Was it a request? Was it an expansion of something that had previously been spoken about or an extension of something previously spoken about? Was it positive or was it negative feedback? So these were kind of the main codes they were looking for. And somehow they did something with the computer to sort of calculate all of this. They were not counting all these by hand.
They did thank the programmer in here. They're like, we had an amazing programmer. Here's his name.
I remember them thanking him. I don't remember what his name is, unfortunately.
Yep, his name was in there. So.
They also then ran it all through a second program that would look at the different kinds of speaker categories. Was the child speaking? Was the parent speaking to the child, to somebody else? Was it some adult that wasn't the parent speaking to the child? Was it some child speaking to the child that wasn't the main child? Or was it just some other rando talking to the parent or some other adult who happened to be in the space at the same time? So you got all these different codes. And when it was all said and done, you have these dictionaries for all of the children. So how much did they speak? how much of the words spoken, in this master dictionary were specific to each child or family interaction. You could sort of see the frequency of the words per child. And this is where they get a lot of their graphs. Pretty much all of their graphs were extrapolated from this data. In case you were wondering, the most frequently words spoken in these 1,318 transcripts that was spoken to the child was you. And the most frequent word a child said, can you guess? Or do you remember from the book?
It was I.
Yeah, there you go, Alan. It was I. And that's the end of the book. That's what we learned. We mostly want to talk about ourselves and our children. So 6 years it took to do all of the work between the observations, between the data crunching, and all they got from all this research was this lousy book, right? They made one. And that's only the first 2 chapters, because now we're going to get into all of the other important parts. But before we do that, if you are one of our patrons who is listening to this later on in the feed, Alan's here and he's hanging out with us. And hey, maybe you will be too in a future time, but you're not today. So I do want to let some of our patrons know that if you're listening to this, you are able to get CEs for listening to this as well at no cost, because hey, you're a patron. We want to give you something extra. So you would just need to email us the code words, kind of like a regular episode, except it's not on the main webpage. So I'm going to give you the first of those code words right now. Alan, I should ask you this at the top. Do you want to be our code word maker for today?
Sure. The word should be, how about utterance? That's a word.
Never used that one.
Utterance. Okay. Utterance. All right. So our first code word is utterance. UTTERANCE. An utterance. Like all of the utterances that Hart and Risley had to code and put into their magic computer program. Utterance.
Rob is known for his many utterances.
You can tell my quality of language. So many utterances. Oh, Diana, hold on. I
just got to write it down.
Diana's writing it down, so I can't keep utterances. I can't utterance anymore, Diana. All right. So here we move into the later chapters. And pretty much every chapter after this is just going to, in some way or another, describe the results. And while I appreciated sort of how Hart and Risley sort of broke their findings down, it did start to get a bit repetitive. It seemed like they're like, this chapter is going to tell you generally what we found. Then this chapter is going to tell us in a little bit more scientific term what we found. The next chapter will be even more scientific. And I kind of wish they just clumped it into one chapter and just be like, just tell me what you found the first time. Like, I don't need you to sugarcoat what you found. Like a lot of these chapters felt like they were written to be like, we're really sad that not every child had a great vocabulary by the end of this process. And we don't want anyone to feel bad about it, but these were the fun. So they spent like chapters just share that we know that there's some sort of a gap. Like, let's get to the research. But hey, that was my thought on it. But chapter 3, 42 American families. This is really where they started laying out the groundwork, what's going to come next. And I think it copied a lot of what they'd seen, is that when they were just talking with children, they weren't talking with children. When they were just observing children talking, all of the children learned to talk. Alan, I think you brought up the quote earlier of just all the children were good. They learned to be good. They learned to talk. They were all talking fluently. Like everyone seemed to be doing just fine from the observations that the parents did. The parents didn't talk that much to the kids when they were babies, and they talked more and more with them as they learned to talk, which, I mean, that's probably how most people are, because your babies don't talk very much. And again, families would fall into patterns. So you'd sort of get to figure out as a family unit, well, this is how this family talks. This is what this family talks about. These are the interactions this family has. But again, you didn't notice it as a meaningful difference until you started looking at the actual transcripts. Sorry, I didn't script that one. It's right off the dome there. And again, what they'd start to notice is that some parents seem to talk a lot, like my household would probably be there. And some families didn't talk that much.
We're a bit of a mixed marriage in that regard.
I do all the talking. Diana just yells at the children.
I do all the talking too, I think.
But the patterns were so stable that they even mentioned that the observers would get pretty good after 6 months to be like, I know how long this transcript will take me, because they knew that this family talked a lot, this family only talked a little bit.
Sorry, I was just going to interject. This was one place that I know later criticism sometimes points that they're sometimes a little, they're Eurocentric in sort of some of their judgments, but they really try in this chapter to say that in some families, interactions were naturally brief with a comfortable silence. Like they talk about these families in very respectful, non-judgmental terms. And I think that's important and could be easily missed if you were going on what later critics are talking about.
I want to second that, Alan. You're totally right in that I think a lot of the criticisms, and again, some of them I was able to read directly. Some of them I was reading sort of reports of other people's criticisms. So I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but there was kind of this sense of what a lot of cultural bias that Hart and Risley had, and they were looking at everything from this the Western centric idea of what is intelligence, what is appropriate language, what is important language, and while I think that is a conversation to have, some of the tones of those criticisms were a bit more harsh than I think they deserve to be given. You're right. How respectful I think Hart and Risley, at least in the book, and that's all I can go on, were to these families. Like there really wasn't an attempt to judge them, or they were like, hint, these are the bad families. I mean, they really were trying to paint a picture of just great families who really loved their kids and did a lot for them, but for whatever reason, and they weren't sure what it was at the time, the later outcomes of the child in terms of tests that they were going to be asked to do, whether you can say, well, those are biased tests. Maybe they are. They're still going to be asked to do those tests later on in life. So it's a valid measure. What they were looking for is, I think, very valid. And they really weren't trying to make any of these families seem like they were bad families. Or you can tell the families that weren't going to do a good job. Like that wasn't the goal. And they went out of their way, I think, to paint that picture. Sometimes I think to the detriment of the findings they had, because they really were trying to make a case that all of these were great families. However, there were differences, meaningful differences in all of the families. And I think sometimes that to the point that I think it weakened their hypothesis a little bit about what were the important parts of the interactions, but perhaps not in a way that was uncalled for, given that they really were trying to be so respectful.
I was thinking almost the opposite, that they do try to point out that they're pointing out factors that are shared regardless of socioeconomic status, and how that changes how there's similarities. Like these are families that are within a very similar culture. We're all American families. And so that maybe when we talk about vocabulary growth and spontaneous speech, these are really important factors to consider, because these other differences we're not seeing, if that makes sense.
It's a good point.
I was surprised that people rarely read books to their kids.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how much of this was like parents of the 80s versus like how we're parenting now, or how our, well, I guess our parents, I don't know what generation your parents are from, but all of our parents, we grew up in the 80s. My
parents read a lot to me.
Yeah, we had a lot of books.
They played with their baby, but they rarely read them. Where they really read with them and didn't imitate baby sounds. I thought that was like universal. Like when a baby coos, everybody coos around it.
Yeah, I did notice that too. And I mean, there's been research to point to babies really, increasing the amount of vocalizations. It's reinforcing to hear their crazy baby sounds back to them. So I was surprised that sort of was like, they sort of like, yeah, nobody talked to the baby.
That's the best they can do, Rob.
Like, these babies. We're not war on babies. They need to talk better in their baby stages. So this is the first time that they bring up the idea that socioeconomic class seemed to somehow predict. They're not saying why at this point, but somehow predict how much talking was going to be in a family. So if you were in that upper socioeconomic class, you were an average utterance to your baby, so 11 to 18-month-old, was going to be 642 utterances per observation. A total, 482 of which were directed to the baby. And then if you were in the welfare group, you were going to have 394 total utterances, 197 directed to the baby. And again, this is the first time you're going to see that.
When you say it that way.
Well, they talk to the child rather than to just whoever was in the room, or just talked out loud, I suppose.
I did like the point they brought up that if there are multiple children in the household, the number of words spoken didn't really increase that much. It's just everyone got a smaller share of like the standard amount. So like those poor third kids.
I've only got so much talking I can do, and I can't do anymore.
I did like it, and I have seen in families too that then the kids will talk to that third kid, right? And they're like, the parent only had so much talk, but then a lot of the talk was kid directed at younger kid.
Yeah.
Right.
And I've seen that. I mean, I only have one kid, but I've seen that in multiple kid households.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. So true.
I often don't even know where the third kid is. So it makes it hard to talk to him.
Some of the same trajectories occurred. So there was more talking when the children, to the child when the children learned to talk. But that pattern of the high socioeconomic classes just spending more time per hour interacting with their child continued. So even though all of the families talked more or interacted more with the child once the child learned to talk, the sort of ratio, I mean, it wasn't exact ratio stayed the same, but that pattern stayed the same of if they talked more with the child when the child was an infant, they also talked more to the child when the child was, I guess, a child.
Well, they broke it down by learning language, infant learning language, and then possessing language, I guess you could say.
And again, as you would expect, the more time you spend interacting with your child, the more utterances there would be to that child per observation. So again, you were looking at 341 average utterances per hour to all of the children across the 42 families, with the professional families having an average of 487 and the welfare families having an average of 178, with the working class families in the middle. And this is going to be a pattern that you see throughout pretty much all of the book. The higher values, not in all statistics, not in all the statistics, but the overall, when they're talking about quantity of language, pretty much the higher your socioeconomic status, the better the prediction will hold true that there will be more utterances per hour. And vice versa for the families in welfare, with the working class families sort of falling in between, with some of them actually having more utterances per hour than the high socioeconomic classes, some having closer or even lower than the welfare families. So you sort of have that wide variance. Yeah, a lot of range.
Yes.
Which is probably why most people only talk about the high and the low results, because they're the easiest to understand. Whereas in the middle, it's like, well, it could be anything. Who knows? The other important part here is that the amount the parent talked to the child in those first 8 months of the observations was strongly associated with how much that parent would talk to the child when that child was 3. So when they were starting to kind of wind down their longitudinal study. But there was a great amount of variability in some of the families. But if we're talking about just what's that range? Hart and Risley. So the low end, that would be about 250,000 utterances versus 4 million utterances per year. Which again, do the math, it doesn't come out to 30 million gap. So I don't know where that came from. Mathematically, that's not even a term that's going to come up in here. But I guess maybe the 22.5 million word gap just did not sell as many t-shirts, I guess.
How'd you do that math?
I just made that number up. That's it's going to be closer to that if you look at the final numbers. So I did not do the exact math. But again, by the end of chapter 3, all the kids are talking. Everyone's doing well as far as, the outside observer would say. But they are noticing patterns in the data already.
Yeah.
I really like there's a page where they talk about the environment, like the richness of the environment for the upper SES families, how there's Sesame Street on in the background and how there's books and puzzles, and the parents have time to coach their children through these things. Whereas the families that are recipients of welfare, they're struggling to keep a livable home, and it's still not very judgmental. And the parents just sound so stressed and lonely. That is what they really convey. Some of their most interesting friends are the characters on soap operas.
Oh my gosh, that killed me, Alan. Killed me.
Because I again, having worked in a Title I public school in a state like Oklahoma, I really felt that I knew families like that, and it really was just sort of a punch to the chest to see that. But what I thought was really hopeful, and again, going back to that respect that they have for these families, is despite this defeat and humiliation, they're still buying them toys. They're still holding their hand on a bus ride to get them to the doctor. They really notice the effort that these parents put in, rather than taking a very judgmental approach that sometimes happens in education and policymaking.
Yeah, I thought that they were very respectful, and I loved the points you brought up. Although right now I feel like living in the pandemic, all of us, our best friends are in the television. And that's just the way it is right now. But
hey, we've all got each other because we can talk about meaningful differences.
I mean, times are different now, but think about the isolation that everyone's experiencing currently and how that's likely magnified as well for different families in different situations right now. The other thing that just struck me from this chapter is, and I know this is a scientific podcast, but I just feel like language acquisition remains so magical when you see the changes for young kids and the amount of language that they learn over time. And that was true in these situations, regardless of these differences, right? They're everyone learned to talk. Everyone learned what they needed to in order to get their points across, and it may have varied as far as vocabulary across groups, but everyone learned to talk. And that's incredible. And the families didn't do anything special to teach it, right? They didn't, consequate language in particular. They modeled language, but they weren't expecting it to occur. And it's still, I know we know some things about how language develops, but we still don't know everything about how language develops. And it is just truly amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that point where the authors talk about, like, they didn't prompt the language, they just waited for it to come. And then when it did, they're like, good work. But they didn't be like, this is milk. It's like, oh, do you want milk? You said milk? Oh my gosh.
Or they didn't purposely do, some of those interactions might have happened, but it wasn't like a concerted effort seemingly by the parents. That brings us to, again, Chapter 4, Everyday Parenting, which is sort of, I liked this chapter because it sort of, I think anyone could read this chapter and have a sense of like, these are possibly meaningful variables. But it does feel a little bit like it could be a bait and switch in that they're just talking about, these are themes we noticed. And then it's only in some of the later chapters. And they actually have a table, I think it's in Chapter 7 somewhere, where it's like, hey, remember that chapter where we sort of just gave some like fuzzy terminology to what we were talking about? What we really meant was functor. They start using the real precise terms that they use in their research. So I don't want to spend too much time, I think, on Chapter 4. I just sort of want to go through the themes because I loved how their headers. I loved how they sort of were describing language and parent-child interactions in these just like warm and fuzzy ways that later will become hard data and regression analysis statistics.
One thing I loved while I was reading this chapter, my almost 4-year-old and I were sitting at the table, and like she was talking about something, I don't know, related to the day. She was quiet, and it was like maybe like 3 minutes. And then she like went to a topic we were talking about like maybe like 45 minutes ago, like came back to it as if we were still talking about it. And I do this all the time. And my husband was like, oh no, there's 2 of you in the house. And I thought about it, how they talk about how kids in this, in this chapter, they talk about how kids then acquire the language that their parents use.
I mean, they pass their interactional style on to the next generation. Yeah.
That's how they say it. Right. And I saw it like, as I'm reading the chapter, this happened. And I was like, oh, wow. Like it really does happen.
Yeah. Your daughter is very much a little you, Jackie. It is true.
It was awesome. I knew what she was talking about, but no one else did. It's because we hang out every day, all the time.
So they're starting to see patterns in their data. So I think they sort of almost like a, what's it, like, like a backronym, like when you make up, like there's an acronym and you sort of make up the reason that acronym exists. This chapter kind of felt like that. Like they're like, here is that the data. Here's all the data we found. But before we do that, let's talk about some themes that we kind of just thought of while we were doing these observations. And then later they will actually play out in the data we have. But it's all going to come down to the quality of language, how much language is used, certainly more specific than that. We'll get more specific than that in a minute, but also the style of the interactions. And sort of when they talked about the pieces that seemed to add quality to parent interactions, hint, hint, these are going to add quality to the interactions in the form of meaningful data later. The observers, I should say, sort of had the best quality utterances in their opinions. They just talked, they didn't just do care talk. They would just talk and talk. They talk to the kids. They talk about what they were doing. There was like a level of social closeness, just like while they're doing something else. They listened. They always just wanted to stop and pay attention to what their child was saying, regardless of whether they added anything. Sometimes they added something. Sometimes they just were like, oh yeah, whatever you're talking about. Sometimes they just, elaborated on the language through those interactions. They tried to be nice, rather than yell at their kid, don't touch that, it'll kill you. They'd sort of remind them of rules or, give them ideas of what they should do different. They'd give them demands in the form of questions like, shouldn't we be putting our shoes over here rather than just like, you put your shoe over here. So, trying to never make them feel bad when they break a rule.
In terms of sort of parent coaching and that side of whether it's ABA or even going into like parent-child interaction therapy, I really loved this chapter to hear that they talked about this, because even in like something like Early Start Denver model, it's like trying to give feedback without making feedback aversive, and they don't couch it in those sort of behavior analytic terms. But I thought it was really important to say that they point out these were really, really important in child development, and sort of that magic that we talk about of language development. These seem to be very impactful. And then again, thinking of, I don't know if you've ever heard of the acronym PRIDE from Parent-Child Interaction Therapy, but it's like praise, repeat, imitate, and describe with enthusiasm. And that just sort of screamed off the page to me in this chapter. So,
oh yeah, I totally hear you, and I think later in the last chapter when they try to sort of talk about, well, what can we do to close the gap? It does feel like they're sort of just describing this chapter again, like, well, we need to have programs that just do all this, or teach parents who aren't doing all of this how to do all of this. And I do like I kind of want to use some of these terms when I'm talking about language development or interactions, rather than like prompt language. Like, just think of ways to be nice to your child. I feel like that's going to get the warm and fuzzies and get much more high social validity on my treatments than like what we need is a really intensive prompt hierarchy. It's like, nope, we're going to be nice is the program I'm telling you to do. Or, we're going to, instead of to like, well, you need to like make sure that you have some number of options. Like, we're going to give choices. We're going to be nice and give choices. Like, if I were a parent, I want that program. That sounds way more in line with, my value as a parent. If I want to be I think of a good parent, I want to have these like positive interactions. I never want to be mad at my kids, right? Let's see. A few more here. They told children about things. So they were just talking a lot. Again, it kind of gets back to the idea of, just so many utterances. Kind of started talking about, well, what should they pay attention to? They started talking about expectations when they go places or do activities. And then the last one, which I thought was a little hard to, didn't really fit with the rest, was that they passed their interactional style on to the next generation. So, but like the example you gave, Jackie, just that idea of, that seemed more results of, by following these other rules of good parents, quote unquote, good parents, the children started doing the same things. They were, they'd be nice to their siblings in their interactions. They'd provide choices rather than demands to their siblings in interactions. But that's normally how they would see, that's how they noticed these things going on. So again, this wasn't a list of things that this is what the upper socioeconomic class families did. This was in every family, there was some amount of all of these happening. But again, as they end the chapter, some families did this more than others, which then brings us into the hard data. So chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, really getting into the hard data of what it was they were looking at. And this really, chapter 5, just sometimes it got a little too mentalistic for me, but at other times it was very precise in terms of what were the types of interactions they were looking for. And when they talk about language, the important parts of the interactions, they were talking about 2 parts, 5 total variables that they were most interested in. 2 were specifically related to the language that was heard in the observations. 3 was more about the interactions between the parents and the child. So it's a little bit of both. It's not just how do you interact with your child or what do you say to your child. It's a little bit of everything. It's how much are you saying to your child and how are you saying it, and in sort of what context are you saying it. So when we're talking about language quality, Hart and Risley are speaking or looking at data related to vocabulary. So just what is the vocabulary the parents use? So just what we think about, like what's in your personal dictionary. What are the words that you use? They go a lot into like, what does it mean to have a big vocabulary? It speaks to how many experiences and diverse experiences you have and your understanding of the environment. And I think that gets a little touchy-feely. I think I understood what they meant. I don't know. Unless you guys want to go more into what they meant by that, I kind of checked a little bit out at those sections of the book.
I did too. I'm not going to lie. I did too.
What I didn't check out, though, was the definition of vocabulary as nouns, verbs, modifiers, functors. Then again, like we talked about, words of these categories spoken to the child or spoken around the child. They also looked at not just the vocab, but the sentences. Again, sentences tell us, how do we perceive the environment and start logic problem solving? Checking out. I think of sentences as number of clauses. What verb tenses are being used? Are there names in the sentences? So labeling and organizing language versus less names being used. So sort of more vague pronouns or just pronouns. So it's there rather than, the specific names of items in the environment. So that's language quality. Vocab, sentences. What were the sentences made up of? The interactions, which again, these all did have later on in the data, all had, correlational value in terms of the achievement scores, in terms of the overall language, in terms of the sort of speed with which children would learn language, the vocabulary growth. All of these were somewhat correlated. I found the interactions to be the most interesting in terms of that some of the interactions tended to have a negative correlation with later development. So this is sort of just, what were the functions of the language that the parents had? And they categorized the functions of discourse in terms of the responses that they were prompting from the child. So there were categories or statements that didn't have a required response. There were ones that prompted action. There were ones that were questions that you were looking for some sort of an answer as a parent. And they'd code these again as declaratives, imperatives, interrogatives, And then they also broke them down into interrogatives that were WH interrogatives versus just simple yes/no interrogatives. They also then looked at, okay, of all these different interactions, which ones were to the child? They looked at differences in prompting, which I thought this part was fascinating, just the idea of how we prompt a child. And I'm sort of thinking about my own interactions with my kids who were really little of, do I just say, here's what you need to do? Or do I give them some sort of a statement that I'm pretty sure they have no idea, or question, they have no idea what I'm talking about. And then when they clearly don't know, then I sort of try to break down what I'm asking for. And then I give them okay, actually what I meant, I need you to do the following thing. But there's this sort of like long prompting, which again, when they were describing it, makes perfect sense as a parent. Like, oh, I think I did that. I'd sort of just talk and I wouldn't treat my child like they didn't know what I was talking about until I realized they didn't know what I was talking about. And then I would try to sort of scaffold what I was saying. So like, maybe you'll understand it when I phrase it this way. And I sort of keep going until I got to the crux of like, actually put your shoes in the bin, or like, please sit down. But I started with the whole like, it's important that we sit down when we're getting on a bus because the bus goes fast. And the kid's just standing and staring at you. And then you sort of, we need to sit on a bus. It's dangerous to stand, okay, sit down now. That level of prompting and that kind of suggestion of, hey, shouldn't you do this rule, rather than no, do this rule immediately.
And I was thinking about this too, about how they said that, when you're looking at how people talked to their kids, that there was a difference even here, right? There was a difference on, what they said is that the higher socioeconomic status families did more of that explanation, did more positive feedback. I think I'm moving into a different chapter, but they did more of that and less of the negative feedback, stop that, don't that, just the rule following, versus the lower socioeconomic family. They added this sentence in, they're like, well, maybe that's what their parents are preparing them to do. Did anyone catch this? Like one sentence that made me feel icky. That one sentence that was just like, well, maybe parents are, teaching their kids what they'll need to know to grow up. And I was just like, oh, don't put that in there, right? Like I wanted to just, if I was like the editor, I'd be like, scratch that.
This chapter, again, it was so important because you needed to know the definitions to make sense of the graphs in the next chapter, specifically chapter 7 or 6 and 7. But in reading it, they spent so much time doing that, Jackie. Like you said, like putting meaning behind language, and not meaning in the sense of later test scores or later amount of vocabulary used, but this like, we were kind of joking around, like, talking about the magical language of properties. This was the closest to like hippy dippy magic that this entire book got, with this sort of just like, these words are symbolic for the purposes of and you're right, Jackie, those sentences of like, oh, well, the professional families, they were teaching logic in the sentence structures they use so they could prepare their child for being in a field where they're doing problems. And I'm like, let's slow down. Like you're already making some big correlational statements in your book. Let's pick one and let's just stick on that one. Like, don't, you're going too far afield a bit. And they dial it back in the later chapters. But this chapter, again, just, I started checking out and I had to reread it because I missed so much of the important part. So when I got to the graphs, I was like, wait, what is a discourse function? What are they floor holding? What is that? And then I went back and I realized, because I checked out. Like I just checked out.
I checked out too. I checked out too as soon as I read that. And I was like, you do not know. Like you took a lot of data, but you haven't like analyzed each reason why that data, like why that language utterance had occurred and in what environmental context. And then when it did, like, you didn't do that level of analysis. And so anytime they made those broad or thoughtful, like I think they called them thoughtful claims, I call them subjective. I got a little mad. And so here's where I got a little mad in this study. Reading this book, because how dare you tell me what I'm doing? Like if I was a parent reading this, what I'm doing for my kid, right? How you, at this point, right? Because yeah, you have the language, but you don't know why I'm doing it. You've not asked me. You've not looked at the data in that way. Up to like preparation for futures, like that made me.
Yeah, and it's looking up and it's looking beyond. I mean, even when they're talking about later on, when they're talking about how long did some of these differences last? Because they only looked up to when the kids were 4 in the original research, and then they happened to have someone who then looked at test scores for about half of the participants when they were 9. And even then, we're starting to get into I get the correlations. And there's a strength there. However, the farther you get from these initial years, the harder I think it's going to be both to prove your correlation is causation and to not just be upsetting people at like, well, I did all these other things in the meeting. So to be talking about like, what are the kids going to be doing when they're 50? I think in terms of what does this language mean, it does go beyond, I think, the scope of the book. And I think this chapter does do some harm in that regard. Like I could see this chapter being the one that people would, could easily pick apart. It's like, well, look at how they're making these judgments. Like they don't have any research to base some of these claims. This is like the think piece you put in your follow-up book or your memoir, your autobiography or something. You don't put it in your hard research in which you're trying to make a point about the trajectory of early intervention for America for the next 50 years. Like you probably want to, cut that part. You're right. This could have used maybe some editing there. It's not that long a book. Maybe they felt they had to stretch it out a little. I don't know.
I would just interject just to get to maybe be charitable and think where they might be coming from, that they're coming from developmental psychology and like language acquisition and things like language socialization. And a lot of these terms are sort of in the zeitgeist of psychology in the 80s and 90s. So I think, and again, thinking about something like the bell curve, which is contemporaneous with this book, that's making some very racist, problematic claims about correlations between socioeconomic status, race, and educational attainment. So I just felt that they're maybe talking to a specific audience, and it's a little over my head what they're doing. So I will say that the valence, when they talk about emotional tone, positive, negative, in positive behavioral interventions and supports and teacher training, they really emphasize like you have children, especially if you're in a school that serves socioeconomically vulnerable children, they're likely going to have a lot more negative utterances, a lot more less praise and more negation and more criticism. So again, I see sort of where it comes from, but you're right that it's the least behavior analytic, and so therefore kind of jarring in terms of what you're wanting to talk about.
Alan, now you're making me feel bad that we had that whole 5-minute, hot take riff there. You're right. I mean, that was a lot of their background, and yeah, there's an audience for that. And I think it is hard to remember that not every book is for us as behavior analysts, and that while there might be valid criticism in some of what we're saying, it is important for us to not, focus too much on just the language that we want to use in our field. So that is a good point. I appreciate that you were here to make that point, because otherwise Jackie and I would just be tearing Hart and Risley a new one for another 20 minutes.
I respect your point, but still feel justified in my response.
Oh yeah, it wasn't a criticism. I was just saying, sort of like thinking where they're coming from. Not that I feel that that's true. Your criticisms are very valid. So, but again, just trying to be charitable, because we said that that's what we were going to try to do. Because I would pick these people apart in a heartbeat over some of this stuff.
Wouldn't it be funny if tonight I was haunted by Hart and Risley and you were not?
Oh, because they did your hot takes on chapter 5 of Meaningful Differences. Too hot. We're going to get some YouTube reaction shots. What? Chapter 5? Whoa! Slow down, man. Don't tell me what my vocabulary does or does not mean for my child's future job, dude. I don't think that's what YouTubers say. I'm old. So, Alan, you brought up the kind of the other factor they were looking at in the interactions was that valence. What was that? The emotional tone. So again, number of prohibitions, number of approval statements, and then sort of the repetition of those in the response to the child utterances. It was kind of sad when they talked about the approval statements being things like right, good, I love you, whereas the prohibitions were directions about stop, don't, quit it, bad, wrong. And again, not to say that like only the good families used the good terms and the bad families used the bad terms. All the families used all of these terms. Like it wasn't a matter of like no parent from the upper socioeconomic classes would ever call it something bad. Now, all of them at some point probably said, I can't believe you did this. That's bad. Don't do that. It was more, as we'll see, it was more the overall proportions, or not even the proportions, just like total utterances, the ratios. Yeah, that richness as they talk about in the next chapter.
I would just want to say that it's the child's words include things like "I hate you." That's a very important thing they point out. but it's important.
I didn't say the parent said "I hate you." Did I?
No, you didn't. Okay. You didn't say it. You were just like that was a phrase. And I like to point that out because one of my go-tos is that the first 4-letter word that children learn is hate. I hate you. That's an important thing. No, you didn't say that, but it was.
I was like, oh no, I'm worse.
It wasn't clear, and I just want to point out that that's what the children said, because that's very powerful. That they did pick it up from somewhere, though. I was just gonna draw that brief.
Good. Okay. No, I was like, oh, I didn't want to like mischaracterize these poor parents from this old research. And then the one interaction style we did not talk about were the adjacency conditions. And these were a little harder to understand, but in terms of just the overall kind of quantifiable nature of interactions, just had to do with sort of, was it an initiation? Like how long since an interaction elapsed between the parent and the child? Was there a statement? So floor holding. So was it a statement the parent made after something that they had said, or was it a statement in response to something the child said? So differentiating sort of the types of interaction sentences that were done.
Well, it seemed to me that this was kind of joint attention. Like they don't use that term, but we get into that, and that's a lot of people criticize this study for the emphasis it places on joint attention. And I think that this section really talks about, like, this soup is good. Yes, it's delicious. Really trying to where the elaboration occurs, and this is that adjacency is where you see that the most. But it is very hard. You're very right.
I think when we think of joint attention, we think of incidental teaching too. What we're sort of, paying attention to are those adjacency conditions. Like something has happened that the child is interested in, and we as adults who know better are going to use this opportunity to teach language because clearly the child is interested, and they're going to be the most motivation to engage in more, language or more verbal behavior. But that's a good point. To sort of, what could adjacency conditions mean in that more behavior analytic terminology that was not used here? Although we use initiations in a lot of our research too. So what we get from all of these definitions are the statistics that we'll be talking about pretty much for the last couple chapters in the book. But again, they're already talking about the patterns they were starting to see, with some families spent more time engaging in the language quality, or they had more quality language spoken per hour, and had more of what we would consider the sort of like positive interaction qualities. So again, they would interact differently with their child in terms of paying attention to more of the child's responses, using more affirmatives than negatives with their child, or demands with their child, sort of, making more questions or interrogatives around the child than just declarative statements at the child. And these are going to be themes that we continue to see into chapter 6. And this is where they get into the idea of the richness. And we've talked a little bit about that, but just the idea of, and I'm sure a lot of listeners and a lot of people who are just sort of only heard about the 30 million word gap are probably thinking, well, isn't there a difference between just nonstop talking, just like a million utterances, and a million good utterances? And this is where I was surprised, because I expected to see, and not only were they more utterances in the higher socioeconomic class families, but every utterance was an amazing utterance. And that wasn't really the finding, or at least in looking at the graphs myself, it really did seem that for the most part, when we were talking about the richness, so like the number of the quality features you would see per utterance weren't too dissimilar across the different groups they were looking. I mean, they were a little bit, but not in a significant way when you look at their bar graphs in this chapter. It was more at the amount. And then that gets at the point of, okay, well, if no matter what group you are in, the quality of your utterances are about the same, then the more utterances you have are really going to be an impactful measure. It doesn't matter that every utterance isn't necessarily more rich across the classes, but there are just more opportunities for all of those rich language quality measures to occur. And I thought that was an important point, because I think it's really the difference between someone reading this and saying, oh, well, yeah, in the welfare and the low socioeconomic classes, they don't talk a lot, and what they say is probably dumb, right? And then the rich people will probably have really smart things to say. So no, all of these families had great quality of language. It really did boil down to not only, but mostly to just the sheer quantity of these utterances per hour. But again, this is one of those chapters that I read through twice. I'm like, is that right? That doesn't seem like the guess hypothesis that I would have made from sort of where they've been going so far with their research. So I mean, what do the two of you think when we were talking about sort of those richness and that quality of language? Was that your read on it too?
You got that right. And I think it's just how the interactions, there was more interactions. And then the next chapters when they talk about more of the statistics and then the importance of the first 3 years, they talk about like the richness was the same. Everyone loved their kids. Everyone's talking to their kids, right? It's not like no one's not talking to their kids, but the amount of talking to your kids then leads for more child-parent interaction, which then leads to more talking about your kids, which then can lead to more varied experiences. So I think their main crux here was that the more you talk to your kids, the more your kids are going to talk to you, and then you're going to be talking about different things because you're going to be talking all the time. So that's kind of what I saw, as like a roundabout like main point here is that more talking leads to more interaction, leads to more talking, leads to varied talking, because you're not going to talk about the same thing over and over and over and over again. Or maybe you are, and maybe that doesn't matter, right? And they said it doesn't really matter if you're talking about the same thing. But more talking is important because more talking then sets the stage for more interactions.
And it wasn't exactly that, there was the exact same sort of like number of multi-clause sentences per hour across the groups. There was some variation, and there's certainly in the upper socioeconomic class, they did see somewhat more of some of those quality components, like we talked about, like more nouns, more verbs, more past tense, more future tense, so different tenses in the sentences that were done. But that didn't seem to be so markedly different versus just the number of interactions. Where you did start to see some more significant differences also were in the number of prohibitions per hour. Right. So for professional parents, for the high SES group, you had about 5 prohibitions per hour. In the welfare group, saw about 11 prohibitions per hour. So again, you're like, well, those numbers aren't that different. Does that matter? But this is where the richness, I think, comes into play. So when we're talking about slightly more prohibitions per hour for the families in the welfare and then some of the working class groups, you have to take into account that we're not just talking about, oh, well, there just happened to be more that hour. We're talking about there happened to be more as a total proportion of the utterances directed at the child. This was similar to in terms of the affirmation statement. So affirmative feedback versus the corrective feedback. You saw 5 times as much corrective feedback in the welfare group, 2 times as many in the working class group. So again, it's not like these families are mean to their kids. That's not the takeaway. But I think someone could get that very easily from some of the sections. What's important is these children are hearing more proportional, constructive, or demand statements that are prohibitive than the children in the upper SES group. So again, it's not a statement of like, oh, all the kids in the welfare group, they're just getting yelled at all the time. It's not that. It's that there were some more, quantity of the prohibitions. It just makes up more of the total amount of interaction. So, one could potentially categorize those interactions as overall kind of more negative interactions. There's higher percentage of those interactions were probably kind of negative, or the kids were hearing negative statements or being told what they shouldn't do rather than what they should be doing or answering questions. So it's really that, it just sort of comes back to that total number of interactions, the total number of interactions. It wasn't that the quality was different so much as just the total number. But when you're talking about a total number difference, you are sort of making it so that, well, the kids in the upper SAS group, they might hear close to the same amount of prohibitions. I mean, divided it, in half or divided by about 5, but they hear so many other affirmatives in that same amount of time that they're hearing more of those, what we think of as like the good, the good interaction words, than sort of don't do that, stop, that's bad. They're hearing much less of that in the total amount of language that they are hearing in a given hour.
I was like, just as Jackie was saying, it seems like there's a relationship that the amount, when you have more that you're saying, the opportunities to have richness and variability in what you're saying is important, whereas richness doesn't affect amount as much. So there's sort of a unidirectional influence there, that more opportunity is important. And it's very important that tone and the valence of what is said, there's more affirmations and all of that, but more specifically, you can't have as much richness without as much quantity of language.
That's very true, Alan. So that's what we got. All the computer programs, everything looked at, the children at age 3. You are seeing these sort of just a higher amount of interaction in the upper SES families, with sort of the working class kind of all over the map in terms of the number of interactions, though, on average sort of fell in the middle of, the number of utterances per hour. And this is where you start getting those big numbers. So, if there's 60,000 word difference in the upper versus the welfare families every week. So it's a 3 million word difference per year. Again, they're not looking at necessarily 10 years of development. The farthest they went was 9. So you're still not getting to 30 million words. And it's 30 million difference. So you're not even getting there. So again, 30 million, that's an overestimate, I think, of the work done here.
I've been trying, I'm going to, before the end of the podcast, I promise I will find that everyone cites this book as coining the 30 billion word gap phrase and then being reused in an article later by Hart and Risley. So it's in here somewhere. I think it's just not, they don't draw attention to it. But I'm going to keep looking for it.
We need that computer program.
Yeah.
We need to put the transcript of the book in. Because I could not find it. And I didn't spend an exhaustive amount of time rereading every single sentence for it, but I'm looking at all the numbers that popped out at me in these chapters. And I never saw 30 million. I saw a million, I saw 3 million, I saw, I think I saw 20 million, a couple, but I never saw it again. So I'm sure someone will email and be like, I saw it, it's right here on page 1. I was like, oh. Then won't we feel silly? This chapter does get a little bit into the types of language used, and like Jackie and I already talked about, and Alan kind of you seconded here. We don't want to spend a lot of time talking about, the family, some of the language they were using means this, and this is what they were preparing their child for. That again started to go beyond what I think was the important finding in their data. So let's not talk about it and keep moving on. So again, the question now becomes, okay, great. That tells us by 3 years old. So some of the, the ages of the kids they were originally working with at Turner House starts telling us, all right, here's what's different in the different groups of families. Here are the pieces that seem to be most relevant. And then when they look at their statistics, so they did regression analyses, they did correlational factors. You do see in terms of areas just related to language. So vocabulary growth, vocabulary use, and IQ score, at least at 3. And again, just using IQ as an amount of what a child has learned up to a certain age, you do see the growth of these scores or these measures being correlated with the factors that we've been talking about in terms of those 3 interaction styles, the 2 language quality styles of varying degrees, some a little bit more than others. I think IQ didn't have as high correlation with all 5 of them. I think language, vocab use, vocab growth typically had a higher correlation. Things like, the sad factor that the net amount of imperatives and prohibitions did seem to have a dampening effect on at least the IQ score that the child received at 3.
Well, you don't know that.
Well, looking at the statistics, I'm not saying that it definitely was, but that.
Well, there's a correlational.
Yes, it was a correlational effect. Yes, sorry, I didn't. You're right. I put too much weight on that statement. But again, I think this points to sort of okay. Well, if you were going to, in a nutshell, or the elevator pitch, what are some seemingly important language development, parenting tips and tricks? You want to have a lot of responses to your child. So fewer initiations, more responses. You want to have a lot of utterances per hour, more affirmative statements, use a lot of nouns, use longer sentences, more clauses in your sentences, more past tense and future tense verbs in your interactions. Do more of that floor holding. So make sure that the child kind of keeps conversations going for longer to increase the total number of utterances. And if you do that, your kids will be just fine, right? Again, it's not that simple, of course, but these did seem to be the components of parenting that were correlated with the highest amount of vocabulary growth, the highest amount of vocabulary total being used, and then the IQ score at 3, which again then begs the question, well, okay, that's great. My kid's doing, quote unquote, well on these tests at 3, but who cares because they're going to do a lot more than just be 3. And this is where Hart and Risley kind of got lucky in that someone was like, hey, can I use some of your participants and do a follow-up study with them when they were in 3rd grade? So when they're 9 years old, I want to do some other tests. They did the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. I'm forgetting the TOLD, but I cannot remember now. I didn't write it down. What was the TOLD? It was another language assessment. And then they did another IQ test on the kids when they were 9. While the results weren't in some ways quite as strong, you did see that some of the language diversity and then the kind of the feedback tone, those components did again have correlations to how well the children did on the PPVT, the TOLD assessment, and to some extent on portions of the IQ test. So the results did point to the child scores at 3 were somewhat predictive, or pretty predictive, I guess, of what their scores would be on similar tests or tests of vocabulary when the child was 9. It was not predictive, however, of some of the other things you would think of as being important to language, like reading comprehension, writing, academic tests. Those did not seem to have, any real correlation with how well the children had done with language. So it's not like, if you can get your kids at these scores with all your parenting by the time they're 3, they're going to do amazing in school. It wasn't really that, to that extent. However, there still were areas of growth that did seem to hold stable from when the child was 3 to when they were 9. And again, there's some controversy about, the measures that Hart and Risley looked at here aren't the only measures that matter. Some of the statements they make in this chapter in terms of the power of those correlations or the power of their regression analysis, like they're making a lot of hay out of very little meaningful data here. So this chapter I think is interesting in terms of what does this mean for overall development, and I think points to some trends that we should be interested in, but does not have the same amount, I think, of rigor. Not in the sense of they did a bad job in terms of rigor. It wasn't their data. They were just sort of reporting on something else someone had shared. So it wasn't necessarily a direct part of the study. So therefore, I think it's just a little less of a meaningful chunk of the chapter. Though something that I think is important and would be a follow-up question anyway.
Well, if they didn't have this, we would cite that as a limitation.
Yes.
Right? So at least they have it to the degree that they do. Mm-hmm. Although I agree that it's not fully predictive of the various ways in which we might measure academic performance for a 3rd grader.
Well, and I was just again thinking and trying to be charitable because sometimes I'm a real monster when it comes to criticizing things. At the time, they were established in their field. A lot of this feels like, here is some more avenues of research that we didn't explore, and maybe this is important. Someone else go look at this. They don't say that explicitly, but a lot of it has that open-ended feel to it.
Yeah, I'm going to second you there. And also, if you read the preface, they hint at a second book. They hint at that, now don't wait, read this one, but then no, we're going to write a book in a little bit that's going to tell you all about what happens next. And I actually, when I read that, I was reading on and I was like, I don't think there is another book. And then I texted Rob and Diane. I was like, is there another book? And they're like, I don't think so.
No.
Meaningfuler differences.
In 2003, they released a follow-up article that's the 30 million word gap. That's a direct follow-up to this. And so I'm guessing that they were trying to do a book, and they're like, we've been sitting on this for a decade, almost 2. So let's get it out there.
Yeah, but still, I was like, oh, where's my book? I need another one next to this. Meaningful differences too, or meaning explanations. Here's what we've done.
Yeah, and in terms of the overall amount of research along this line, there've really only been, they may have, I didn't do an exhaustive search, but it seems like there have only been 2 other studies that kind of did a semi-replication of Hart and Risley's original work from the 80s, which seems surprising. I would have thought someone would have done a full-scale replicate. Well, everyone was 2.5 years, no thanks.
It's so much work.
And we had talked a little before we started recording about the Sperry, Dr. Sperry out of, I can't remember, but how they had done all these transcripts with some similar types of families. And so they're like, hey, we could probably replicate this study to some degree after the fact. So, and that's a big replication. But again, it was not someone intentionally doing this. They just happened to have the same type of data. And so they went back and did it as sort of an afterthought.
I think their research did take into account a couple of the criticisms relating to bias that was in meaningful differences, or there wasn't taken into account into the meaningful differences
they're very
research.
Ethnographic. That's what they talk like. They're ethnographic psychologists. They draw from anthropology. So they're very much not behavior analysts doing developmental psychology. They're doing a whole different kind of research. It just happened to overlap.
So I think when we kind of get to the end of this chapter in terms of, are these later tests, is this a real measure of the exact same thing that Hart and Risley were measuring? To some extent, not necessarily. There's definitely room for criticism and room for more research here. However, I think the statistic that I actually found the most heartening in this was when they were looking at sort of some of the statistics and sort of looking at how can you account for the variance in results on the test of language, so again, the PPVTR Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, it did seem like those 5 variables that we've been talking about in terms of the language quality and the interaction variables, accounted for more of the variance than simple SES. And I think this is the important point, because I know for me, when I was a young undergrad in psychology, and you'd see statistics about like kids from high SES families do better and kids from low SES families do worse, your kind of gut take home is like, oh, it seems like there's nothing you can do. If you're rich, you do better. And if you're poor, you do bad. And that wasn't the point that Hart and Risley were trying to make at all, even though some of their findings sort of mirror that very, very surface level amateur interpretation it was a gross I was young at the time, okay? I didn't know much better. It was the first thing I'd read in psychology. It really is more a matter of components of those interactions, which then means, okay, so if you wanted to, and again, there's some critique about whether you should want to, but if you wanted to close that gap, you do have ways that you could think about treatment options or, enriched language options that go beyond just like, sorry, you're rich, you're going to be like this, or sorry, you're poor, you're going to be like that. And I did appreciate that from this chapter, the sense that it's not just about, well, hey, those families were better off, therefore, of course, their kids were going to do better. It really had to do with specific components of the language and of the interactions. Again, that occurred more with the families from a higher SES group. And they didn't get into the whys or the wheres. And to some extent, I think that's irrelevant. What matters is that there is something that we as sort of researchers and we as interventionists could look at in terms of a treatment package or a parenting training package, if the goal is to just take these differences and close the gap. Just the differences in terms of the rate of language acquisition and the amount of language at years, just to close that gap, there would be something we could do. Which is great, because I think it's really easy to look at that 30 million word gap and say like, wow, that seems insurmountable. Oh, rich people again? Those rich people, oh well, give people more money. Like, I mean, that's not the take home at all. I think it's very easy to make it the take home if you're not reading the actual book.
And I think so again, we're talking about this book in the context of the war on poverty and its supposed failure. Not supposed, it actually did fail horribly. But they hint at like parent stressors being a big part of this potentially. They don't ever come out and say it, but they're very clear in multiple points that the welfare families or the sort of middle families, they don't have as much time to spend with their kids, and they don't have a television or the finances to buy toys and things like that. And they hint at that, and they never come out and say it. But I think it's important that they do mention it, because sometimes I think it was very intentional that they put those things in here as a potential, like, if we're going to talk about big policy, here are some things we could do. But we're talking to educators, and so we can't address those quite as explicitly.
Yeah, I think, Alan, that's a great seg into the conclusion of the book. We get to the last chapter, and you're sort of hoping like, okay, Hart and Risley are going to lay it out. They're going to tell us exactly what to do. And they do sort of get at the idea of some ideas of maybe if you wanted to close that language gap, it would probably take like an extra 40 hours a week. It's not just about more utterances. It's about setting up environments where there are more opportunities, both for the children to hear a lot of language, to hear a lot of different language, but also to set up an environment that is going to allow for easy delivery of more affirmatives per hour for the child, less prohibitions, more questions, less initiations from the teacher. So just, an environment where the child can react, and then adults can react to what they're doing and saying rather than just telling them all the time. So it wouldn't be as simple as just putting in a room where like a tape recorder like talks at them for 40 hours extra a week. They do sort of have this vision of like, well, you could have a program that's about like 40 hours a week with substitute experience. You could do some sort of like training program for parents, maybe use young people who are teaching the parents to engage with these kinds of language interactions, these types of interactions, as well as, and then they sort of put it in together, kind of going back to that war on poverty, idea or the ideology of, and this could be part of like a parent training / job training program where the parent has a mentor, so someone who's helping them out. So like you said, Alan, they are speaking to the idea that being in the lower socioeconomic groups is going to be more stressful in many, many ways. And so it's not just a matter of like, well, these people just need to get a job and learn to talk to their kid. No, there's a real number of barriers that make it challenging, and then trying to add something into whatever that package is that speaks to that. And it's not just, we're just going to teach you how to do a better job. You're not a good person. It's, we understand that this is really hard. And here are the ways that we can help you. We can, help you, with some of the interactions with your child. But just help you, make you feel comfortable about the process that's happening. And they don't get into, a ton of detail of what that could be. They give an example from, they cite the Milwaukee Project as what they would consider a successful program of this nature in terms of tons of, transition, work with the families. So, working full days with the parents, having a paraprofessional who's in the house, for increasing amounts of time before the child goes into daycare, adding, joining the family with activities, talking about concerns, advising the mother on, various things in the arrangement, and then, helping the mother with remedial education. They cite the mother in the Milwaukee Project. I don't know if fathers were included in that. And then on-the-job training to become a nurse's aide. And, that they had very positive results, that the children in the project had, scored on the national average by 8 years old in terms of, however we were measuring accomplishments whenever that project went into place. So again, one idea of what a program like that could look like. But then the problem becomes, well, how would you get that program up and running? Because it sounds very expensive and very, very time consuming. And like most things, it's probably very expensive to start. And then overall, we're talking about like the cost of education and the cost of many of the programs that then need to be in place to try to help remediate some of the challenges families and children are facing is probably a lot cheaper, net cost wise. But nobody wants a policy that's going to cost a lot of money now, maybe save money later. They want one that saves money now and then maybe bad later, but I won't be in office then, so no one can blame me for my policy failures. And again, that's me just being cynical. It is the end of election season after all. Our election season is over, I guess, now. And then they kind of end with like, but I don't know. I hope people kind of, I said in my notes, it sounds like they're like speaking to the proletariat or something in terms of they're like, the people need to rise up and complain. And then maybe there'll be a special interest group that will look at more options. Like I felt like their overall thesis really was undercut by their kind of like, I don't know, maybe policy change ended up being their conclusion. So I was a little disappointed that they didn't have a stronger vision of this is what it should look like. And this is exactly what we need.
I mean, for me, I feel like they're like using this point about increasing vocabulary as like the linchpin for all of these other future successes or failures. And I'm just not sure that that's like the end all be all here, right? Like who says that that's the thing that we need to focus on to this degree? And yeah, I'm sure that there are training programs that you can do in order to try to increase this particular variable, but are we really looking at it in the larger context of all the other variables that may be present in these families' homes and lives? And there's a lot of other things that are likely impacting the parents' opportunities to engage in this larger vocabulary, right? Including, and I know you touched on this, Rob, but just overall family stress and the experiences that are their day-to-day lives. And, I've been at home now for 8 months with my children, trying to do my full-time job with them here. And I think that I have been under a level of stress that is very different than my normal life. And I can see that in how I interact with my kids too. And
your husband.
Yeah. Yep. You're still here as well. And, and there's a difference when you're like, everything's taken care of. I feel fine. I feel like my life is in balance. I don't really have anything else I need to focus on right now other than let me just spend some quality time, some QT with my kid, right? We're going to talk about things, or we're going to play a game or whatever it is, right? And you have my undivided attention. That's very different than what my life currently is, where it's like I'm working at home. My job never ends. My family's always here. I can't leave my house. There's a crazy amount of stress going on, right? And there's never a time where it's just like, things feel settled. Let me like really devote my time and attention to your, growth as a tiny human, right? And right now I just want everyone to like leave me alone so that I can actually complete one single solitary thought.
Hashtag truth. And I had to say that right there because you couldn't even complete your solitary thought.
Thank you. Right. And that's just a microcosm, right? Like I'm still very, very, very privileged in the life that I'm living, even with those current caveats. So that doesn't compare to having spent a life underneath that level of stress and how your perspective could be completely different. So do we really need to be focusing on how we're going to train parents to use more language at home, or do we need to be looking at some of the larger picture challenges that families are facing and how we can help ameliorate some of those stressors?
Yeah.
They mentioned, for instance, like the Home Builders program, which is one of those family preservation programs that you guys talked about with Dr. Carr in one of your episodes. And I could see like that being a very natural place to maybe add this in as a module of like, this is another way that we can really, help these families out as part of an overall skill set. But it's just a shame that they don't push on that a little bit more. And I wonder if that's been done. Like it's sort of, they suggest it as a good place for it, but then does it happen?
Well, I think that's a good seg, Alan, in terms of moving on to what happened after this book came out. Because I, was looking at, okay, so did this book, because everyone cites it, everyone talks about it, but has it just become a soundbite? Is it one of those things that, everyone just does it now? Everyone pays attention to the findings so much that we don't even think about the impact it had. But when I was trying to look into specific policy shifts, I wasn't finding like, and now this program exists, and this is why everything is so much better in America. Like I wasn't necessarily finding that. I was finding a lot of focus on early intervention that talked about this gap and talked about the use of language. But then my question became, is all anyone took from this the idea that, hey, language, we should do something there. Let's put that on the front of our webpage and it'll sort itself out later?
Headsprout directly modified the curriculum based on this book, and Headsprout is widely available and still very popular and does produce really great data on their programming. So, Headsprout right there in and of itself. Well, Headsprout and Head Start.
You mean Head Start,
Head Start.
Mm-hmm. Head Start.
I was going to say Head Sprout's more like a directed instruction.
I've been doing it a lot. But Head Start, I think, is a direct plus strength coming out of this book.
But every time I hear about Head Start, I'm sort of thinking more of what they, Hart and Risley originally were doing at the Turner House rather than the breadth, I think, of what they were sort of overall recommending could, reach the goals that they saw as being important. But again, I haven't been involved in that program, so I don't know for sure exactly what the ins and outs of it
right. But
are.
I do think, too, what Diana was saying is I don't think you can change parenting styles unless you change the environmental context around. And there's not policy right now that makes it easier for people to live and have kids at the same time.
Well, yeah, and there's certainly been, I think some cities have looked at initiatives. I know there was one up in, I can't remember where in Canada, maybe Toronto, where they really were looking at taking into account everything we've learned about stressors and achievement gap in relation to families on the lower SES groups and trying to take everything into account. So it wasn't just we're going to give the parents training and a job. It wasn't just we're going to teach them how to, change some of their interactions with their children. It really did take into account the reality of this is only a few things in that you need to, respond to in a given day. And it really did feel like one of those, it takes a village kind of programs. And they were getting good results, at least as I don't remember what episode of Freakonomics it was, but they did a whole one where they interviewed that research group and the results seemed good. But again, it was one of those policies that you listen to and you're like, this sounds great. Like, I can't imagine the average politician agreeing to do something like this. This just feels very, I hate to say it, but these feel like very quote unquote un-American kind of policies where we're going into people's houses and telling them what they need to do. And I think it does get into some of the criticisms later on of this research in terms of, it's all well and good, even if quote unquote, know the answer. I'm air quoting all over the place right now. If you know the answers, it's this is the research result. This is the treatment that you should use. You still then need to place a value on the importance of that treatment. And not just in terms of statistics, but in terms of a variety of measures, many of which are not considered to be culturally sensitive already. And that, I think, adds another wrinkle into this discussion of Hart and Risley are very clear that this is research done for a very specific subset of America at a very specific time in history. and that this isn't necessarily research that's going to generalize to families that are in, I think they mentioned like being in like really, difficult or crime-ridden neighborhoods, or families from other countries, or immigrants, or families who English is not their first language, which does make up a larger portion of the American population now. So some of the research that was done probably doesn't hold quite as true as it did in the mid-'80s. So are we going to make a lot of policies based on this research that doesn't speak to the experiences of the modern American family and their background?
Well, I was just going to say, I feel that we did see some policy made around this, at least in the sort of general conversation of like No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds Act. This book starts about talking school-based interventions, and then we get into sort of the home life, and then we don't really go back about what school is. And so then this idea of the 30 million word gap gets sort of embedded, or the achievement gap gets embedded into school policy and what teachers need to do. And then it becomes part of like teacher assessment, under things like the Marzano teacher assessment system and things like that, which doesn't really speak to what the authors were doing. Like they were trying to help families and they happen to be educators, but then as you sort of point out, we don't feel comfortable pointing at families and saying, you need to do this in your home. So what's our closest proxy to that? Oh, here's schools. I may just, I may be just a little hypersensitive because, again, having been a teacher, this is where I heard this and was often made to feel responsible for if my student had an achievement gap. It was mine and mine alone to fix. Of course, we work with families, but it's really your job and you're going to be assessed on it. Are they closing that achievement gap, which is just problematic and stressful.
And that's very true. And, as much as it would be great to say, like, as long as you get them here by 3, they can do whatever in school and everything will be great. We know that there are differences in children's later success that relates to the school component of it. So now are we talking about, two potential deficits? So one in terms of, they're starting school here in terms of their language growth curve, which again is not the be all end all. It is an important variable, but not the only variable. And then depending on what school they're in, which is probably going to be linked to their socioeconomic class, they're going to have X amount of growth, this amount of growth. Are people going to spend too much time pointing the blame of like, well, this is what they were like when they got here. How'd you expect me? Look at their vocab curve. Why did you think they were going to learn more in my class? Versus, okay, let's come back to what are the solutions? What are the treatments? What can we do? Yeah. Can we agree upon what those even could be?
But also, what are we really measuring here, right? And like, is this really what we're trying to measure and base success on, or there are different dependent variables that are really going to tell us more about an individual's later success in life and or their quality of life that may not be so fraught as far as how we got to those numbers.
Yeah.
I think we sort of fuzzy logicked our way to that point as opposed to having a clear path of evidence.
Yeah.
Alan, you mentioned Sperry as a researcher that has done some work that was kind of a semi-replication. I know I read a study by Gilkerson from 2017. It was a speech and language article that also did somewhat close replication to Hart and Risley. They used a algorithm to do segmenting and categorizing. They were able to put microphones on the children. So they didn't do quite as many overall recordings, but they did get more language total because they used modern technology. And they actually did get somewhat similar results to Hart and Risley. They didn't get the 30 million word gap, except when you're looking at sort of like the highest and the lowest sort of values they got in their study. But they did notice that gap continued to exist. So the socioeconomic word gap from the children from the high versus the lower socioeconomic classes, they said was closer to probably 4 million than 30 million in terms of the overall gap, overall the years, unless you're looking at sort of the outlier values. But again, that pattern did seem to still exist. So if anyone was thinking maybe we accidentally stumbled upon a solution to this one problem in the meantime, not really. No, there's still a gap. I mean, maybe it's smaller. Maybe Hart and Risley's, the measurement techniques weren't as precise as we can make them today with technology. Whatever the reason, there's still, just looking at this issue, there's still work to be done. And I guess as we're wrapping up, what's everyone's kind of big take-home point from this book? Either something that you learned that you think is important for your own practice, or something that you just think is going to be important as a big picture policy question. However you want to kind of conclude your concluding statements.
I think what I really liked is we talked about in one of the chapters where they start to sort of open up. They have some nice language about how to, sort of being nice about enforcing the rules. I like some of that very respectful language when talking to parents, especially parents that may have a lot of vulnerability in terms of socioeconomic status. Yeah, I think that's the big one for me. There's just so much in this book that can be picked apart that I wasn't entirely sure where to go next.
I hear that's the trouble with the book clubs. It's fun to talk, but we talked for over 2 hours and it's still like, oh, we've got so much more we probably could say if we weren't getting tired. Jackie and Diana, how about you?
I still do appreciate just the length that they went to gather their data and the care that they took in carefully analyzing their data. But I am just generally speaking in sort of a burn it all down kind of mood / phase in my life. So I want to just start over asking a different question.
Same here.
What question?
The question I've been saying this whole time.
So it's not.
Oh, is this important? Is what they're measuring the important measure?
I'm not sure this is the measure that is the most important measure.
Okay.
I'm saying the same thing too. Is that I love the book. I like the research. I would have asked a different question that takes into account more sensitive measures, because the American family is not a real entity in a sense, right? Mm-hmm. Because none of us have the same cultural experience as everyone else. And so I would ask a completely different question with different dependent variables that takes into account more variables around culture. But that's just me. And so that's where I would go next, right? I would also probably burn it all down as well. But
and the entire education system too.
Right. And that's okay, right? That's okay. That's what I would do, because that's what research does, right? We don't burn it down, but we build up. So we got this. I don't think it's the best measure. I don't know what the best measure is yet, right? Because I've not done the work here to tell you what the best measure is, but I know that there has to be something better.
I'm shocked at the both of you. You're usually such level-headed, supportive people. And to hear you both utter the phrase, burn it all down, it is either too many hours of podcasting or this is just 2020 is really wrapping up and you're just all feeling it.
It's because I'm 40 now. That's what happens when you turn 40.
I'm not 40 yet, Diana.
You will be when this airs.
That's true. That's so true. Good.
Alan is the only one hearing this episode when you are not 40, Jack.
But anyway, and I'm not saying I don't love it, right? I think it's valid, and I think it's something we need to start somewhere, right? But this isn't where we end, because research isn't like that. That's not what happens when you're a researcher,
right? And you have to be okay with that, and okay with saying that this wasn't perfect, and we're going to build upon it.
Well, one thing I would say in terms of all the criticisms that have come out from various sources of this research is everyone did seem complimentary of Hart and Risley, both in the work they did and in their overall attitude towards this work, that they were never like, nope, we did it. Right. We said this, therefore this is, they always were very, again, this is reported, I never spoke to them about this, but always reported as being very open to the idea that there were limitations in this study and they were aware of the limitations that existed and they wanted more research to be done in this area. So I think they would be happy that there's still criticism, that they're still being talked about. And I am glad that there are people who are asking, really challenging questions. I don't know. I think this is an area where I would rather not see it burn it all down. I think I'd rather see let's build on what's been done and just think about ways we can take that into account, whether we replicate, whether we do extensions, but build on this rather than just start all over again. I don't know. Maybe I'm just in a different mood, which is weird. I'm usually the burn it all down guy, so I don't know what's going on today. It's all topsy-turvy.
You get to leave your house. I think that's what it is.
Because you think you're anti-establishment, Rob, but you're not.
No, you found out my secret. I'm really a poser. I'm
man.
Totally, oh no. Oh my God, I'm the man.
All right.
I'm getting the wrap it up signal from my producer over here.
I'm giving it to you too.
Well,
So
I know. No, I know. I am so excited. You know what? I don't know about you guys. I had a great time talking about this. I'm so glad that Alan was able to join us.
Out of all of your Patreon supporters, I was so happy to be here. Also, just randomly, page 198. That's where they talk about the 30 million word gap. They don't say it explicitly, but the numbers are in there. Figure 19, 198. And figure 19.
Oh, it's buried in a figure almost at the end of the book, eh?
They talk about 45 million words for the professional family versus 13 million words for the welfare family, et cetera, and then in Appendix B. So it's in there. It's just not explicit. But
you are amazing.
I'd say 26 million, though.
It's 45 and then 13. Go read it. You'll find it.
Well, Alan, we were very happy that you were here. We're happy we were able to do this for our patrons, and we were glad that you were able to come. And hopefully you'll be here at other book clubs because we'll be doing a few more of these this year. And we hope you can come to every one and be a member of the show because you had so many, really, I just love the perspective you brought to the show. So thank you so much for being here.
Me too. I loved it.
Well, thank you all. I appreciated it.
Well, for everyone out there who is listening, you're listening to this because you are a patron, and we thank you very, very much for supporting us that way. We hope you enjoyed this. We'd love to hear your feedback. Since you are able to earn CEs for listening to this, you and only you, it's special for you. The second code word is corpus, Corpus, corpus. That is our second code word, and you can just email them directly to us in that regard because you are patrons if you're listening to this. We were so glad that you were here, and we want to say thanks to all of you. Thank you to Alan, to Jackie, to Diana again for having such a long discussion all about meaningful differences. We'll be back in a couple months with another one of these book clubs, but don't forget, patrons, you can join us every month, every other month where we're not doing a book club, for our social get-togethers where we don't talk quite this long, but we hope the conversation is just as scintillating. And I guess that brings us to the end. Thank you, Hart. Thank you, Risley, as well for writing this book. We'll see you all here at the next ABA Inside Track Book Club. Goodbye.
Bye.